Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku was the kingdom's chosen Omega. Secrets, love, and power. Here is short summary. Izuku Midoriya has been sheltered from the kingdom and the world for most of his 21 years of life, kept locked away in the castle from alphas and suitors. He is kept under close watch, for he is the kingdom's chosen Omega and their future. He has been guarded all his life by his personal protector, the great swordsman Yagi Toshinori. Inexplicably, his father the Duke decides that his son needs an additional guard, and hosts a competition for prize of protecting the most important Omega in the realm. The victor is a beta male who crashes his way into Izuku's life, and later into his heart. Both of their secrets threaten to crush and shatter the kingdom, should they choose to let them. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. The few scattered clouds did little to affect the hot sun beating down, baking the arena's concrete. There was plenty of movement about the seats. The audience was restless, conversing and flitting about, many of them waving handheld fans in a desperate attempt to cool off. Sweat dripped in rivulets off of the servants who scurried among the audience, delivering water and ale that had long since lost its chill from being stored in a cold room. The only shaded area in the whole arena was, of course, the Duke's suite, which was only graced by the presence of a handful of people. The awnings on either side of the wooden contraption were guarded by 2 soldiers each, their armor's golden accents glinting wherever the sun was able to catch them. One more guard stood directly behind the Duke's chair, where a young servant girl filled the Duke's wine cup. The Duke watched her intently with his dark red elfin eyes, ready to scold should she dare to spill any of the liquid. One hand swiped the cup and brought it to his lips for a healthy gulp once it was filled, and the servant fled to the back corner of the suite, undoubtedly not interested in having the arena grounds in her view. Duke Midoriya's other hand clutched the armrest of the chair to his right. The tendons in his hand flexed as he resisted the urge to place his possessive grip where he truly wanted to, the seat's occupant. His son. The prized Omega. Said occupant brought a handkerchief to his face to dab the sweat off of his upper lip, careful not to expose more than the lower half of his face, the only part of him that was visible. His full lips were parted, panting lightly at being so heavily clothed in his pristine white attire in such heat. He resolved himself not to utter a single word of complaint, for this was the first time in years he had been allowed to step foot outside of his royal quarters of the castle, let alone the castle grounds themselves. The prized does, however, complain internally. Surely the competition could have been delayed until cooler months when the fighters won't be sluggish from the heat. The Duke had instead been adamant that the event be prepared and staged with the utmost haste. The prize never thought he would see the day his father would be so eager to again appoint another to be in his son's company, along with the other personal guard, more than the Duke could himself. That was the purpose, after all, of the day's congregation in the arena. Armor clinked as the entrance began to fill the arena grounds from 3 tunnels, each carrying 1 weapon as per the rules of the competition. Each fighter had been searched moments before, both for extra weapons and for any characteristic elfin traits. A plethora of eye colors adorned the entrance who had come from every corner of the kingdom, but none of them were the same hue as the blood that was about to be spilled. Once the grounds were filled and the tunnels empty, the Duke rose from his perch, aided by his blood-red cane. Behind him in the Omega, a skinny blonde guard, the only one with a purple cape instead of gold, stood straight, his blue eyes flitting all over for any potential threat to the Duke as he prepared to speak. The arena had been designed and built so that his voice could reach most of the large stadium without having to yell. Yelling was, surely, uncomely of a Duke. Welcome, my people, to the first tournament of its kind. A hush fell over the crowd as the Duke's voice echoed and the fighters each knelt, their heads bowed in fealty. We gather here in what I can only hope is considered a most joyous occasion under the eye of the one true God and in honor of our King Shigaraki. Among the brave souls before you, one will emerge victorious as the personal guard of the most precious being in all the lands. The Duke gestured behind his back, bidding his son to rise and join him to be visible before the crowd. My son, the prized Omega, the kingdom's delight, he must, Of course, be protected fiercely and bravely by a devoted beta, who will not lay a single finger on him. The Duke broke his cheerful facade to glare, just for a moment, at the beta fighters, before putting the smile back on his face. As you all know, the fighting will begin at the sound of the horn and is to be contained within the arena stage. There will be no fleeing and no mercy. Some of you will be injured. Some of you will be slain. He lifted his cane. But all of you must fight, one against all, for the honor of the most esteemed position for a soldier to hold. Ready yourselves. The crowd broke its silence with waves of cheers, clapping for the bloodshed to come. The 24 competitors spaced themselves away from each other, most of them smart enough to keep their backs to the walls of the arena stage. Most of them, except for one. The prize felt even more nauseous as he watched one entrant take his place in the middle of the arena, unsheathing his sword with an almost bored demeanor. Sunlight reflected blindingly off of the others' helmets, but this beta's armor was rusted and dull to a disrespectful degree. How could a soldier of the kingdom wear such unbecoming armor to such a prestigious competition? How could any of the king's subjects turn his back to his fellow competitors to gaze unashamedly towards the Duke's suite? But he did, tilting his head arrogantly as he regarded the still panting form of the prize. The omega flushed beneath the high neckline of his gown, feeling grateful for once that his figure was hidden behind the thick cloth. Even through the shade of the hood that hid the upper half of his head, even through the rusted helmet that hid most of the soldier's face, the prize felt the stare of the soldier cutting straight through him. It felt like he was under his skin. The prize allowed a slight frown to grace his lips, expressing his displeasure at the blatant disrespect and stupidity. The soldier's own lips turned upwards, smirking as though he had not made himself a target for all the other fighters who were bloodthirsty and desperate to win. The Duke stood a little taller, jerking at the soldier's audacity, frowning as well. He shook himself slightly, taking a large swig of wine from his glass before biting out another smile, gesturing for the servant girl to refill his glass. By fortune or misfortune, no one could say, this gesture happened to be in the same direction as the woman who stood next to the large ceramic horn behind the suite. She jumped, not pausing to think it odd that she was being called so soon after the Duke's speech, before breathing in a hefty breath to blow with all her might into the horn. Both the Duke and the prize, along with most of the crowd and a few of the fighters, startled at the loud, unexpected bellow of the horn. The soldier with the rusty armor, however, did not hesitate. He moved much quicker than someone his size should be able to, racing to his left to jab his sword through another beta. Blood sprayed the wall behind him as the beta's dying scream was drowned by the rancorous shouting of the bloodthirsty crowd. Another beta fell to the rusty soldier's sword before the other competitors managed to jump into action, turning on each other with clashes of swords, swings of axes, and hits with maces. A handful of them near the rusty soldier turned to him with determination in their gaits. The soldier merely danced around them, knocking one of their maces from its owner's grasp with a single swipe of his sword. Not just his mace, the crowd realized as blood rained down on the arena ground. His entire hand had been severed, leaving him to fall to his knees and wail. The rusty soldier dealt with the others accordingly, dodging most of the blows from the smaller betas and parrying the rest. The crowd watched with awe and expletive-filled cheers as the rusty soldier parried one such ferocious blow in the direction of another beta, whose armor crumpled under the mace. Everyone could see that the rusty beta was still grinning, gleeful as he cut down his opponents. A different beta tries to sneak up behind him, his hammer trembling in his grip. But his footfalls seem to be too heavy, too loud somehow even with the volume of the crowd, for the rusty soldier spins with a swing of his large sword. His opponent's head is nearly severed from his body by the blow, drenching rusted armor with crimson blood. The soldier wrenched his helmet from his own head to see better, with not a care for how vulnerable he now was. A shock of blonde hair gleamed in messy tufts under the sunlight, making him even more of a clear target to the dozen remaining opponents. He greeted the challenge with a small grin, twirling his sword ostentatiously before unleashing his passion for violence. The rest of the conflict was a blur for the prize. Puddles of blood littered the stage of the arena, glimmering in the sunlight almost as brightly as the armor of the fallen competitors. He held out hope that someone, anyone, would fell the soldier draped in rusted armor, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Even with half of the remaining fighters charging at him at once, the rusted soldier outplayed them all. Played, because this seemed to be a game to him, judging by his smile. He cut them down without hesitation, without pity, without second thought. Several times, he stole a fallen soldier's weapon from their corpse with his free hand and used it against his foes, striking them down with a weapon he had never before wielded. Every once in a while, the prize thought the soldier would send him smug glances, but they were too brief to tell for certain. The Duke glanced at his son several times throughout the skirmish, fingers twitching with the urge to reach out and clutch his gloved hand. But the prize did not appear to be affected by the bloodshed other than the still present downturn to his lips. Not disgusted, not offended, not appalled. Simply observing with an air of disappointment. With time and much more spilled blood came the moment there were only two left. A male beta who wielded a heavy axe that had cleaved many skulls in the past few minutes faced the man clad in rusty armor. The latter took a stance never before seen by the crowd, as if he truly considered his opponent to be a formidable foe. The axe wielder was large for a beta, larger than ever the rusted knight, who himself was not of a meager size. The axe wielder struck first, swinging his weapon diagonally in an attempt to circumvent any attempt at a dodge. But the rusty knight was quick and agile, able to avoid the blow with a sideways roll that had his armor clinking against itself. The axe wielder did not falter. His endurance seemed to match his strength as he swung again and again and again. The rusted knight did not bother to try to parry any of his blows with his sword, for it would surely shatter under the momentum of the heavy axe. Their battle was extensive, and most of the crowd felt winded just watching it. The rusted knight was able to injure his opponent twice, yet only with scratches. Any deeper blows would have taken longer, and his foe wielded his axe with a speed unbecoming to his size. The audience seemed to hold its breath collectively as the rusty knight managed to slash at the other's shin, but not deep enough to cause any damage other than an inconvenience. The prize noticed that the rusty knight began to slow in his speed, and felt elated. He seemed to be breathing hard and was less precise in his strikes and his movements. So much so that he was unable to properly dodge an impassionate strike from the axe wielder which managed to skim the left side of his waist that his rusty armor failed to protect. The soldier jumped back, cradling his side with his free hand as he panted and recovered from the first blow laid upon him during the entire skirmish. He seemed to think for a second, eyes briefly flickering to the Duke's suite before settling on his opponent. He twirled his huge sword once, twice, before charging, uncaring of the blood dripping from his side. His foe met him bravely with a fierce swing of his axe, aimed directly for the head. The rusted knight lifted his sword to meet the opposing axe for the first time. It predictably shattered into pieces that nicked each of them, drawing yet more blood. The axe wielder's surprise at the disastrous parry was visible, and the rusty knight took full advantage, sending him to the ground with a strong enough kick that the axe was knocked from his grasp. The resulting hand-on-hand struggle was not as one-sided as expected. The rusty knight was slightly smaller, yet he held his own, holding his foe down with clever contortions of his body. They each landed blows on each other, focused on the face in attempts to incapacitate. Eventually, though, the rusted knight, his face free from being obscured by a helm, managed to bite down on his opponent's exposed wrist. Hard enough to not only draw blood but to rip tendons. The axe wielder howled in pain, clutching his wrist with his uninjured hand, which was more than enough to give the other an opening. And he took that opening. He took it with his long, bloodthirsty fingers. One finger on each hand wormed its way through the eyeholes of the axe wielder's helm and sunk home. Blood spurted from the victim's sockets as the fingers dug in, hooking to pull the eyeballs free of their prison. Only after they were free did the rusty soldier yank off his foe's helmet, revealing his plain brown hair that was soon to be stained red. For the soldier cradled his foe's skull, now devoid of eyes, between his large hands and squeezed with all his might. He was strong, even stronger than he looked, for the skull caved beneath his might and splattered its crimson sustenance all over its slayer. The victor panted for a few moments, regarding the carcass beneath him. The pattern of his breaths perfectly matched that of the prize, who had been watching the whole ordeal with a knot in his throat and a tightness in his belly. Slowly, carefully, intentionally, the soldier wiped his hands on the armor of his fallen foe, somewhat ridding them of blood, before rising and turning to the Duke's suite. A smirk still adorned his face, barely showing his white teeth, yet, it now seemed more genuine. He approached as close as the arena stage would allow, slinging an arm over the wall with the confidence of someone who had a decent day as opposed to someone who had just slayed nearly a dozen violent opponents. He raised a single eyebrow, a few shades darker than his bright blonde hair, as he regarded the royal suite. The Duke was unhappy. It was palpable in the tense line of his shoulders, the pursed lips, the furrowed brows. He could not, however, express it verbally, for the tournament was his idea and, therefore, his responsibility. He spoke, his voice unwillingly reverent. "What are you called, Victor?" The soldier wore another small grin, showing no more than his incisors. "Katsuki. You were to address me as your grace." No response. "Your family name, soldier?" "I have none." The prize barely resisted his urge to scoff. The Duke frowned. "Surely you jest. If you must know, my mother was a whore and my father a sire of bastards. There is no surname to speak of when it comes to me." Duke Midoriya went rigid as the prize watched on in disbelief. No one else had ever spoken such crass and blunt words to the Duke. "You are the sole victor of this competition, Katsuki," the Duke bit out. "Do you accept the position as the lead personal guard of the realm's most precious delight, the prize?" "I accept him." Again, the soldiers, Katsuki's, gaze seemed to transcend all physical barriers. Physical distance, veil, it did not matter. His eyes focused on the prize, demanding and potent. A shiver ran down his spine at the attention. "Very well," Duke Midoriya declared, "you will be directed to your post. As for the audience, I can only hope you all have as thrilling of a day as the royal house has." The prize was grateful for the disguise of his veil when he rolled his eyes at his father's words. Thrilling was not quite a synonym for abhorrent, after all. "He will join us, soon," the Duke murmured, his fingers lightly tracing the jawline of his son. "Are you nervous?" His other hand followed the veins of his son's hand. The prize began to shake his head, paused, and then gently nodded. He still did not understand why he now needed an additional personal guard when he never before had more than one, did not understand why the Duke had not personally appointed a trusted individual to the task, and instead allowed any subject of the kingdom to vie for the position. "He himself will be carefully watched before he is your primary protector." The Duke moved his hand to the neck of the prize, stroking gently. "He will never lay a finger upon you. I will make sure of this, and so will Yagi." "Thank you, father," the prize said, his first words of the day. The Duke smiled, somehow gentle and foreboding at the same time. His eyes drifted over the stature of his son, lingering on the only visible flesh in the form of full lips and a sharp jaw. Armor clinked from the entrance of the throne room where father and son conversed, causing them to stand up straight and turn their attention to the new entrant. A man entered, tall for a beta, his hair blonde and golden, his eyes dark and serious. His previously worn rusted armor had been shed, and he wore commoner's clothes. "Your Grace," Katsuki murmured, his lip curling slightly. A dribble of spit landed on the tiled floors from his address. "Katsuki," the Duke said, his eyes cold and calculating. "How pleasant of you to join us. Is it not what I was meant to do?" Katsuki's brown eyes flickered to the prize, glimmering with fervor. "You are to hold a most prestigious position, commoner. Do not jest in the presence of royalty. Now, tell me the truth of your surname." Katsuki pursed his lips. "I have not once yet lied to you. My parentage is irrelevant. I have worked up my skills with blood and sweat, and entered today's competition with honor befitting of this position." A hand drifted to his injured side, which had been bandaged. "I have never wanted anything more than to serve the prize." Duke Midoriya narrowed his eyes. "And yet you arrived with dirty, rusted armor when everyone else's was gleaming. Not very honorable, in my eyes. Why clean the metal when I knew it was to soon be bloodstained?" Katsuki challenged, glancing briefly at the Duke's son with a glance that could set even a stone castle on fire. "That would have been time wasted. Armor is armor. I can always make do with what is available to me." The last sentence seems to slightly soften the Duke as he regards the soldier's clothes, which are equally as dirty as his armor has been. "You will require a new wardrobe." "Understood." And new armor. That is befitting to your station. Understood. The eye contact between the Alpha Duke and the Beta soldier was explosive. Demanding, and invasive, as if each man wanted to dissect the other's brain. The Duke lifted his chin, still defiant against such a disrespectful man taking the position of his son's personal guard. You must be well acquainted with the grounds and the surrounding areas, should you perform your job adequately. The Duke shuffled, uncomfortable, as he rested his hands upon his son's hips. None were permitted to see the affection other than devoted servants and members of the royal guard. Your lack of familiarity with the castle will be welcomely refreshing for one in your position. You must never become lax in your duties. Katsuki nodded, his face serious for once. I will take my role very seriously. Do you swear it? I do. Katsuki then looked straight at the Omega, his eyes flickering down to exposed lips for just a moment before he bowed his head and lowered to kneel on one knee. With my life and my sword, I solemnly vow to keep you safe. From this moment until our last moment, I am yours. The Omega's cheeks heated under the veil. With what emotion, he knew not, but the ways the traditional oath was spoken and slightly changed by the night were perplexing. The Beta had vowed to keep you safe, instead of keep the prize safe. In the next sentence, he had changed the pronoun in my last moment to our last moment. And, at the very end, he had proclaimed himself as yours, instead of your protector. The vows that every royal guard pledged, usually to the Duke, were not meant to be so personal. Intimate. The Duke frowned, once again displeased. He said nothing, likely couldn't, for the mistakes could be easily dismissed as misremembered. Rise, said Midoriya, squeezing his son's arm one last time before letting it go. You should find a man called Sorihiko Torino now. He is the commander of the castle watch and will be your guide. Katsuki didn't acknowledge his directions, instead choosing to stare at the prize again. The Omega did not look back at him, not even from behind the shield of the veil. You haven't spoken yet, Katsuki said. What's your name? The prize turned his head away while his father grunted, annoyed. He does not speak to anyone except me, his Omegan servants, and his guard. I'm his guard now too, aren't I? You are new to the role. The Duke's lip curled. Do not overstep. You do not need to know his name to perform your duty. Katsuki put his hands up placatingly. I understand. I'll be on my way then. He still stared at the prize, sighing when he received no acknowledgement. He turned and strode out the door, allowing it to bang slightly as it shut. The noise caused the Omega to jump, and the Duke turned to him, cooing, to kiss the top of his head. I must be going now, too. There is much to do. Stay in this room. I'll find Yagi and send him to escort you to your tower. The Duke placed one more kiss on top of the veil before he, too, left the room. The prize's fingers fidgeted, worrying at each other. He slowly breathed out the long breath he had been holding since Katsuki had asked for his name. Izuku, he breathed out to the empty room. My name is Izuku. The surface of the warm water of the bath rippled as Izuku shifted, raising his left leg for better access. He shivered at the tickle of the scrub brush on the sensitive skin of his ankle and foot. His cheeks, unveiled as was allowed in the safety of his chambers, were red from the heat of the bath. His devoted servant, Uraraka Ochako, knelt beside him. A pillow rested beneath her knees at Izuku's insistence. She scrubbed eagerly at his skin, careful to peel away any dirt or sweat while not being too rough with her fellow Omega. That tickles, Izuku complained as the sole of his foot was scrubbed. Ochako scoffed, rolling her warm brown eyes. You are extremely dirty. What were you up to today to build up so much grime? Izuku shuffled, uncomfortable. Yagi let me walk the gardens today. It must have been that. He left out the part where his mentor taught him to break out of various holds. His servant raised a brow but shrugged complacently. She scrubbed a tad quicker, causing Izuku to hiss at the intense tickle. Oh, calm down, you baby. I bathe you every night and still you shudder at your feet getting washed. Be better. Izuku frowned. You do this on purpose. Maybe. Is it so enjoyable to irritate me? You're not irritated, Ochako laughed. If anything, you're grateful for the touch that comes from someone other than your father. Silence filled the humid air of the washroom. The servant gulped in disbelief at her own insolence. Izuku sighed at the truth of the statement. I didn't mean. It's fine, Izuku said kindly. I understand what you mean. It is forbidden for the prize to be touched by anyone other than family and servants, and my father's touch is not a kind or genuine one. Ochako shrugged again. You said it, not I. Anyways, I know you're truly not close with him, but do you have any inkling as to why a new guard was assigned? She finally removed the sponge from his skin, dunking it in the bath water and squeezing it out to rinse it. No, none at all. Izuku sighed, stretching his rubbed raw leg during the break. What irks me more than being appointed an additional guard is who was passed up. Explain. Tenya was the obvious choice. Izuku kindly chose to ignore the slight blush that was brought to Ochako's cheeks at the mention of the dark-haired knight. He has guarded me before, in the few instances that Yagi wasn't able to. He knows the castle, knows my schedule, is devoted to the royalty, and would never be lazy in his duties. You said that the Duke appreciated his newness to the castle, Ochako pointed out. Perhaps that is why. It could be a part of the reason, Izuku thought. He flinched as Ochako reached into the water for his other leg, pulling it out with a splash. I don't believe that is all, though. The public spectacle of the slaughter disguised as a competition was unnecessary. There's something we're missing. Ochako frowned as she started cleaning Izuku's muscular thigh. I never predicted that he would let someone other than an Omega or Yagi so close to you. Izuku relaxed under the gentle massage of his upper leg. You and me, both. The Duke is manipulative, calculating, and vile. His obsession with me is worrisome. The servant paused at the flagrant insult towards the Duke. You must not say such things in this castle, Izuku. A shiver ran down Izuku's spine at the rare use of his given name. It's fine, Ochako. He may be my father, but he is still an alpha. He is not permitted to come to this tower. Not even betas can be here in my chambers, even Yagi. Or rather, even my guards, since it is now more than one individual. Ah, yes, your additional guard. Ochako's eyes gleamed with mirth. I would bet this month's wage that you are ecstatic that he will stand post outside your bedroom door tomorrow night. Don't remind me, Izuku groaned. I don't know him. I don't trust him. I'll likely barely sleep. Ochako hummed. I understand. You'll stay up all night for the chance that he'll join you. In your bedroom. Izuku gasped, scandalized. I would do no such thing. Why would I want that to happen? He's gorgeous, Ochako swooned, taking a break from her scrubbing to feign a swoon. I mean, not as handsome as a certain knight, but he has a unique appeal to him. If you find arrogance and disrespect appealing, then I suppose. Oh come on. Ochako smacked his shoulder with the sponge, spraying bubbled water on the floor, before resuming to scrub his calf. I see you two staring at each other all the time. I do not stare, he contested. And even if I did, you wouldn't be able to tell. My eyes are covered during most times. I can still tell, Ochako bragged. I think you lie. Izuku grunted. No amount of money, prestige, or flowers in the realm would persuade me to look at that beta in any way other than negatively. Ochako bit out a shrew chuckle. And yet here I am, scrubbing between the prized Omega's toes for a barely livable wage. He rested a wet hand on her sleeve, uncaring of the way the cloth became wet. Ochako, I didn't mean. I know, I have no control over the wages of the servants. If I did, you would be properly compensated. My father is too rich to justify his frugality. Ochako smiled again, genuine this time. Do not worry yourself into a frenzy, Izuku. I know it is all attributed to the Duke. She was overly gentle cleaning his right foot to calm him. Besides, I don't have to pay for my chambers. This is the only job in the city where that is possible. Additionally, I get to serve the sweet, gentle prize. Izuku snorted. I am anything but sweet and gentle. If you think otherwise, then you do not truly know me. I know that, you dunce. Have you ever heard of irony? Izuku used his hand to slap the water's surface, spraying droplets all over his servant. She laughed as she danced away, not before throwing the sponge into the bath to shower his face and torso with soapy water. He groaned, wiping himself with an extra cloth, while Ochako giggled as she grabbed a fluffy towel. At least she had already been finished bathing him. Come now, Ochako called out. It is past your bedtime. I'll dry your hair for you, all right. The kingdom of Umbrengrad was officially formed in the year 53 AR, Izuku read. The Draconians had been eliminated, including their prince, the heinous cursed one, leaving nothing but peace for the Shigaraki family to rebuild within. Remnants of the Draconian, both in object and in being, but the Shigarakis governed with an iron fist and a peaceful rule, just as God decreed. A quiet sigh came from the corner of the small library, where Yagi stood guard. The priestess heard it, though, and shot him a savage glare. We need not any interruption, guard. This is an important lesson. Izuku safely rolled his eyes behind the veil. An important lesson on the history of the kingdom, sure, if only he had not read it dozens of times before. The dragons were extinct and magic was outlawed. The realm had never known such peace. Those within the Shigarakis who were not in the direct line of succession were named as dukes and lords, along with allies devoted to the crown, to alleviate the weight of the rule on the king. The king was always destined to be an alpha, as God decreed. No beta or omega or even another alpha other than King Shigaraki has ever held the throne after the draconian extinction, only Red Eyes ruled in the history of the kingdom. The current king is blessed by God to live for centuries. He took over the throne once the draconians were slaughtered and has held it ever since. Izuku paused then, sniffing. The dust between the pages of the old book was affecting him. Continue at once, insisted Priestess Shiozaki. Izuku ignored her, face scrunching up before he let out a loud sneeze. Driblets of snot landed on the book's pages. How could you? Shiozaki exclaimed, rushing to close the book and move it from Izuku's range. That is one of the original copies of the realm's history. You have sullied it, just as you have tainted yourself time and time again. You are wholly unworthy of being the prize. Surely you know this. Turning his face towards the ground to hide it, Izuku grimaced. Leave it to the priestess to shame him for an uncontrollable bodily function. The priestess rose from the table and stomped over to a shelf to place the book. She raised her chin as she declared, "The Duke will hear of this, rest assured. This lesson is ended." She stormed from the room, black skirts billowing behind her even in the stagnant air of the castle. Izuku let out a loud groan as soon as the door shut, burying his veiled head in his hands. She is from the hells themselves. Yagi chuckled as he approached the table. You were as patient as you could be, I'm sure. The Omega scoffed. She deserves no such favor. She is vindictive and cruel for no good reason. I do not disagree. Yagi pulled out a chair, collapsing into it with a shuddered groan and a hand over his side. The Duke will take your side, surely. Izuku forced a smile, though his heart dropped. Of course. I have not had a chance to ask you before now, but how are you feeling? What do you mean? Izuku asked, furrowing his brow. With the new guard, Yagi explained. Katsuki. He seems quite skilled. I agree with that, but that is the only positive trait to him. Izuku frowned, mulling it over. He is arrogant and disrespectful. Violent and aggressive as well. Yagi shrugged, smiling. Disrespectful and arrogant, perhaps. But he seems honorable and passionate, and he will make a good guard. It would do you well to give him a chance. Get to know him. Izuku let out a rare, mirthless chuckle. I can't even speak to him, Yagi. He makes you nervous, doesn't he? Yagi chuckled. What? Izuku exclaimed, affronted. Of course not. I'm talking about my father's orders. Yagi's brows furrowed. But he is your guard. You must be able to converse with him. After all, you do with me. Yeah, but you're old. The beta finished, laughing again. No. Izuku reached under his veil to scratch at his neck sheepishly. I just meant to say that you're more experienced and trustworthy. It's fine, Izuku. I have eyes. He winked. I see what everyone else sees. A young, good-looking soldier. Good-looking if you are blind, perhaps, Izuku lied. In truth, he knew that the blonde beta was handsome, but his arrogance was off-putting and his ego didn't need any more inflation. If you say so. Yagi's blue eyes twinkled. He pulled out the chair that the priestess had sat in and took a seat. You know, I don't think you ever wrote back to Kota. You're right. Izuku gasped, reaching for the middle of the table where there was a stack of parchment, a quill, and an inkwell. "I'm the worst brother ever." Yagi merely hummed in response as Izuku dipped the feather quill in the inkwell and started to write. The only noise was the quill scratching against the parchment. It was nice to be with someone whose company did not require constant conversation to be enjoyable. Izuku liked that about Yagi. It reminded him of his brother. His mind was scrambled, for the letter, only a few sentences long, was covered in crossed-out mistakes. Izuku huffed, setting the quill aside to crumple the paper, and threw it on the ground before grabbing a new one. "Izuku," Yagi gently chided. Izuku ducked his head. "I'll pick it up later to properly dispose of it. I'm not a barbarian." "No, those are long dead," Yagi remarked, gazing at the discarded copy of the entire history of Umbrangrad. Izuku paused to look at his guard. "How are you feeling these days?" Yagi hummed questioningly. Your injury. Does it still pain you?" Yagi shook his head. "You don't need to worry about that." That was not a no. Izuku squinted at him, choosing after a moment to use his gift. He expanded his senses, focusing on Yagi. The resulting pain he felt was tolerable but still significant. His abdomen ached, the pain blooming from the upper left side and affecting most of his torso. "Liar," Izuku scolded. Yagi dared to look affronted. "You shouldn't be using your gift on me, my boy. It does you no good." Izuku scoffed but willingly withdrew his senses. In truth, he used his gift of feeling others' pain far more than his mentor knew about. A light knock sounded from the door at the entry of the room before he could answer. Yagi lifted a brow at Izuku, who shook his head. Neither was expecting company. "Enter," Yagi called out. The door swung open, revealing the last person Izuku wanted to see. In walked Katsuki, his blonde hair exposed as he held his helm in one hand and rested the other on the pommel of the sword at his hip. Izuku hated to say that his new armor suited him. The steel was well kept and shiny, the gold accents matching the beta's hair. The purple cloak identified him as a guard of the prize, and it billowed behind him as he stepped into the room. Katsuki looked at Izuku for far too long before nodding in greeting to Yagi. "You busy here?" he asked bluntly. "Not at all," Yagi responded. Izuku kept writing. "The Duke calls for you," Katsuki told the older beta. "Something about word from a Todoroki." Yagi flinched. "Ah, yes, he was expecting this. Thank you for letting me know." He stood, stretching and sighing as his joints cracked. "I assume he sent you so that you could watch over the prize in my absence." He spoke deliberately, taking care to not use Izuku's given name. "Yes, I'll be going, then." Yagi walked to the wall next to the door where his sword belt lay. He waved at Izuku. "Give Kota my best, will you?" Izuku nodded in response. His heart pounded in his chest as Yagi stepped out, closing the door behind him. This was the first time he had ever been alone with Katsuki. Someone else was present during the other times they were together, usually Tenya or Yagi. Currently, though, he refused to look at his guard, instead focused on his now third piece of parchment. "Who's Kota?" Izuku jumped at the sound of his deep voice. Other than that, he showed no reaction. "That's who you're writing to, right?" Katsuki leaned against the wall, his armor clinking. "A friend, a lover." Tensing at the tease, Izuku balled up his current letter since his startle had ruined it with a line of ink. He threw it to the floor. Always so quiet, never speaking, never smiling, never laughing. Why even show your pretty mouth if you're not going to use it? Izuku gritted his teeth, refusing to even frown at the taunt. He did internally frown at how his new letter had quickly become complete gibberish in the first line. He discarded it, the same as he had the others. Katsuki stepped away from the wall and closer to the Omega. "You're going to have to talk to me at some point, you know. I guarantee you that I'm more patient than you are stubborn." Izuku huffed slightly. His instincts told him that this man was anything but patient. And Izuku was very, very stubborn. "Can't you at least write out your name?" Izuku couldn't believe he was pleading with him. "I need to call you something other than that ridiculous title, and I have a feeling you'd hate being called a term of endearment." After still being ignored, Katsuki leaned over to pick up one of the discarded letters that had been fully written. Izuku didn't realize what he was doing until it was too late. His guard easily avoided Izuku's gloved hand that shot out to get the letter. There was no time for Izuku to get up and fight him for it, as Katsuki's eyes immediately sought out the bottom of the page. Deku, Katsuki questioned. He smirked. Why would the Duke name his precious Omega son such a dumb name? Izuku bristled with irritation. He couldn't help himself. He balled up his current letter, which had been going so well, and launched it with all his might at Katsuki's head. Katsuki ducked out of the way and laughed. At last, you reacted. You're a little spitfire, aren't you? Fuming, Izuku reached for more parchment. Katsuki swooped in first, snatching up all of the remaining blank paper. Izuku looked at him, unamused. Talk to me, Deku, Katsuki said once more. This will be no fun otherwise. Come on, I know you talk to your other guard, and he doesn't even do his job properly. Izuku slammed his hands on the table, nearly breaking the quill. It made Katsuki smile and keep going. I was so disappointed when I came in here to find him lounging at this table, back to the door, his scabbard across the room. He flicked through the pile of paper obnoxiously. If I was an intruder, I could have killed the both of you in seconds. Izuku stood then, trembling with anger. Don't speak of him that way. He knows what he's doing. No intruder has entered my tower. Ever. Katsuki looked ecstatic. Finally, beep. Don't stop there. Keep going. The Omega sighed and sat back down, fiddling with his gloved hands. Resuming his silence would only make the outburst more embarrassing. Give me the paper, he said quietly. Smirking, Katsuki held the stack out to him. When Izuku reached for it, he swiftly pulled it away with a laugh. When Izuku frowned, he acquiesced and handed them over. Don't be such a bore, Katsuki chided. Izuku hoped he could feel his glare. Don't tell my father that I spoke to you. He paused then. He'll what? Katsuki teased. Make your bedtime earlier. Withhold dessert. No, I think your creepy father would much rather punish me. So worry not, Deku, I won't tell him. Don't call him creepy, and don't call me Deku. Izuku shook his head, returning his attention to his letter. He was nearly finished, finally, and needed to focus. Of course, Katsuki had to keep talking. Tell me your name then. I'll use it once you do. You can't call me by my given name. Even as your guard. Izuku nodded. What does Yagi call you? Izuku didn't answer that, and Katsuki smiled victoriously. Izuku ignored him, placing the quill to the side. He gently blew on the letter for a few minutes to dry the ink faster, disregarding a peculiar tingling sensation in his skin. He decided he would wait longer before attempting to roll it up, not wanting his words to smudge. As he was looking down, he noticed that he had gotten a bit of ink on the glove of his right hand. He frowned at it, bottom lip pouting slightly. Ochako was going to scold him if he ruined yet another pair. That was the third one this week, and it was only Wednesday. The tingling intensified, causing Izuku to look up. He inhaled a quick breath. It was obvious that Katsuki was staring at his lips, and had been for some time. His eyes were heavy-lidded, which made him look all the more alluring. His gaze slowly drifted from Izuku's mouth, lazily drifting about his form. There wasn't much to see. Izuku's clothes were always baggy and shapeless. Sitting, though, caused the torso of his dress to pull tighter around his waist. Katsuki's eyes lingered there for a while before returning to Izuku's face, right where his eyes were. It felt as though he was looking straight into them. Izuku let their stares hold for much too long. The ink had long dried by the time Izuku tore his gaze away. He confirmed it with a risky touch from his already stained hand. Your glove is stained, Katsuki said, finally breaking the silence. Obviously, Katsuki smiled at the snark, opening his mouth to respond. He was interrupted by yet another knock at the door. Rolling his eyes, Katsuki called out, yes. The door opened, and in stepped Tenya. Izuku resisted the urge to smile at the knight's appearance. A conversation between these two would be very interesting. Hello, prize. Tenya bowed his head towards the Omega. Katsuki cut his eyes to Izuku with a sneer that represented exactly what he thought of the title. Katsuki. I am Tenya Iida. I often watch over the prize when Yagi is unavailable. Katsuki smirked at the jerky movements of the knight's arms as he spoke. I heard. How come you weren't officially appointed then? Instead of me? Tenya snapped his mouth shut. His brow furrowed and he looked to Izuku, who merely shook his head. Katsuki only shrugged. It matters not. Now, Katsuki said. What brings you here? Tenya's posture straightened. The Duke summons him. I suppose you are to come along, as well. Come at once. The knight led the way out of the room. Izuku followed close behind him, refusing to thank Katsuki as the guard picked up all of the balls of paper. The walk to the Great Hall was a tad too long to be comfortable. It was not on the other side of the castle, but in a different corner than the Tower of the Prize. Surprisingly, Katsuki did not make any snide remarks to Tenya or tease Izuku along the way, likely because of the many eyes that watched their odd little party. The halls were somewhat crowded since it was so close to dinner time. Most that stared were staring at Izuku. Even though a majority of them had lived in the castle for years, if not decades, it was not often that the prize was seen outside of his tower, which most were not permitted entry. Some, though, looked at Katsuki. At the enticing figure he cut in his armor, at the sharp lines of his face, at the way his light hair reflected the flames of the braziers. A few ladies giggled as he passed, vying for his attention with waves of their fans despite the chilliness of the castle. He paid them no mind, though. His eyes flitted about, stopping at Izuku every so often. Despite being a crude and teasing bully, he took his position seriously. Izuku clasped his hands in front of him as they entered the hall. The room was scarcely populated. The Duke stood next to the fireplace with another, unfamiliar man, and two guards stood at either side of the large door. The Duke smiled at his son as he approached, then gestured for the two guards to shut the doors. They obliged, leaving the room as they did so. Come here, son. The Duke waved him over. Izuku hesitantly obeyed, regarding their unfamiliar company from beneath his veil. Their guest had peculiar hair, half red and half white. His eyes were also mismatched, the left one blue and the right brown. He had a large burn scar on the left side of his face. Tenya remained at the door, hand on the pommel of his sword, while Katsuki followed dutifully behind Izuku. The Duke's eye twitched, but he did not address it. I would like to introduce you to our guest, Hisashi proclaimed, waving one hand towards the visitor while the other held a goblet containing an unknown liquid. This is Shoto Todoroki, the youngest son of Lord Enji Todoroki, who lives in the capital. Izuku carefully chose to give a small nod to the Todoroki boy, nothing more. He had not yet been permitted to speak, and the physical touch required for a handshake was certainly not an option. Shoto looked to be no older than Izuku himself, though he was tall for a beta, though not nearly as tall as Katsuki, and his tight attire showed off his lean muscle. Aside from the scar, his face was well sculpted. Surely he would be the subject of the castle's gossip for weeks to come. A pleasure to finally meet the prized Omega, Shoto said, bowing his head to Izuku. I must say, I did not expect him to be so heavily clothed within the comforts of his own castle. The Duke bristled. He is only unveiled before me and his Omega servants. No other. That is the only option that befits his station. Shoto nodded placatingly. I understand. He is the prize, after all. He looked to Izuku, a slight tilt to his head. Shall I share our news with him? No, I will. Hisashi took a large gulp from his goblet, causing the air to fill with the scent of strong liquor. Shoto has brought wonderful news from the capital. Lord Todoroki has placed his eldest son's name up for contention for the prize's hand. Izuku willed his jaw not to drop. His eyes widened. This was unexpected. It was Katsuki who exclaimed. What? Why? He must know he stands no chance. Nothing is guaranteed, responded Hisashi. The prize is expected to marry into the Shigaraki line, sure. However, he has not been officially promised to them, and no courting has begun. Shoto fiddled with his thumbs. My eldest brother is old enough that he must marry soon. He will take over my father's assets one day, which are plentiful. My family is prestigious and close to the king's family. It is a beneficial match. Why send you and not your brother, then? Katsuki challenged. Hisashi glared at him for it. My brother has been busy outside of the capital, Shoto responded. There have been Worrisome events occurring in the kingdom that must be addressed by someone trusted by the king. Shoto's eyes cut to Izuku, careful to not say more about such events in his company. Chuya is a fearsome soldier and a proficient leader. He was the obvious choice to be the investigator. I have other siblings, but they are much more busy than myself. My other brother is training to be a silent one, and my sister is an educator for the young lords and ladies of the capital. Izuku clasped his hands, accepting the explanation. It was not unexpected to give time-consuming tasks to the youngest sibling, whose time was the least valuable. He had heard of Chuya before, the passionate first son of the esteemed Todoroki patriarch and a loyal sword to the crown. He is said, however, to have suffered from extensive burns on the majority of his body, from what, it was not known. Still, why choose a lord over a king? Katsuki asked, still obnoxious. It makes little sense. Like I already said, the Duke remarked exasperatedly, the king has yet to put forth a formal courting. His son is still very ill, he cannot even leave the capital. It would not be wise for him to pledge the young Shigaraki for marriage before he can follow through. Katsuki nodded, pacified. Shoto looked at him curiously, asking, I thought the prize's guard was the legendary swordsman. All Might, is it? You are much too young. Hisashi answered before Katsuki could. He has been newly appointed to his post. He won the position in a tournament. He hails from. He trailed off, looking confused as he turned to the guard. The farms of the Brooklands, Your Grace, responded the soldier. Nowhere exciting, I fear. The Duke nodded. He and Yagi share the duty of protecting the prize. He turned to Shoto. They will follow him, whether he ends up in the king's palace or your father's grounds. I hope this will not be a problem. Shoto shook his head. Not at all. Competent guards are a necessity for any prominent family, of course. Son, Hisashi called out. Izuku flinched in surprise at being directly addressed. Won't you greet our guest? Izuku paused, shocked. The only time he had used his voice outside of his tower was when he and his father were alone together. This was unprecedented. However, he could not ignore an order from the Duke. Thank you, Shoto, for bringing us this news. I pray you have been received well. Shoto didn't smile, but his mismatched eyes grew warm at the sound of the Omega's voice. It was no problem at all. Indeed, I feel very welcome. I am starting to get hungry, though. Hisashi waved him off. Dinner will be served any minute now. Shoto nodded, turning to the Duke. Please know that my father does not expect a swift response. He merely wanted to make it known that Chuya is a contender for the hand of the prize. Of course. Hisashi turned to Izuku and took his hand. Supper will soon be ready. In light of such joyous news, you may eat here should you please. Izuku nodded, careful to hide his eagerness. It had been years since he had been allowed to dine outside of his chambers, let alone in the Great Hall. Very well, said Hisashi. Let us prepare for dinner. The Great Hall was packed to the brim. Shoto Todoroki had not come alone, of course. His host included guards, several soldiers, servants, and various consultants. Each table of the hall carried fruits and various meals that were in season. Rabbit stew was a consistent meal on all tables, along with roasted lamb and several vegetables. The true dessert would be available later, but for now, there were just strawberry rhubarb pies. Izuku ate slowly, annoyed at the pile of vegetables his father had forced onto his plate. He much preferred meat, enjoying the way the tender flesh collapsed between his teeth. He sat to the left of the Duke, a most prestigious position. Shoto was on the Duke's other side, so Izuku couldn't speak to him. Across from him were two familiar Alpha Lords, Lord Nito Monoma and Lord Sen Kaibara. They whispered to each other, their words shielded by the clamor of the hall, eyes resting upon Izuku. Katsuki stood several meters behind Izuku, his hand on the hilt of his sword. As always, he regularly surveyed the room, carefully checking for any threats. What do you think, prize? Monoma asked bluntly. Izuku startled, then slightly frowned in confusion. They knew that he wasn't allowed to answer verbally. He looked to his father, who had drunk enough whiskey to make his movements sluggish and his blinks extremely long. He would not notice either way. About your future, Monoma explained. After all, There is little reason for Lord Todoroki to send a son here other than to vie for your hand. Izuku only looked back at them. Despite his father's drunkenness keeping him from being able to scold him, he refrained from responding. After all, the Lord continued, you are less than a year from your maturation. I can only hope that you are still in this castle for this moment. I would love to see it. Izuku shifted uncomfortably. Quite the sight it would be. Do you agree, Sen? Oh yes, Lord Kaibara agreed. Any Omega looks good when they're helpless and panting, let alone the elusive cries. He licked his lips leering at Izuku. Izuku's hand drifted to his thigh, ready to deploy his hidden weapon should it be needed. Both lords took hearty swigs from their cups. It was certainly not their first drink of the night, given their bold behavior towards the prize. Izuku merely sipped at his own wine with his free hand. Well, whoever he marries, said Nito, is a damned lucky bastard. I know we can barely see him, but I'm sure he's ethereal. Why else would he be hidden away? I agree, said Sen. He must be exquisite. Say, prize, would you like this banana? Show us what that nice mouth can do. He held up the fruit mockingly. Izuku did not understand what they meant, but it was surely a way to embarrass him. He clenched his fists so tightly that he could almost feel the silverware warp between his fingers. He took a deep, calculating breath. The knife at his hip was kept extremely sharp. In theory, he could quickly slash both of the lords' throats before they took their next breaths. Seeing them leer at him, the urge to slaughter them inflated. After all, he is an Omega, teased Nito. Nothing more than set of ho. Every soul in the hall jumped at the sound of a blade being embedded into the wood of the head table. The wielder was Katsuki, who had used a long dagger to block the path between Izuku and Sen, who was reaching out with the banana. He glared at the lords with the anger of 1,000 suns, his armored chest heaving with anger. The Duke was startled, looking dazedly at the commotion before lifting his cup for more wine. A poor servant girl tended to him, refilling his goblet with dark red liquid. Nito yelped belatedly, what the hell are you doing, you oaf? How dare a beta raise a hand to an alpha? Katsuki sneered, his hand still on the pommel of the dagger stabbed through the table. You are harassing the Omega that I vowed to protect. You are lucky your head is still attached to your neck. Monoma paled. Despite being an alpha, he was much smaller than Katsuki. Shorter, less muscular, and with a much less dominant aura. Relax, guard. Protect your liege from actual danger, would you? He said, still shaking. Katsuki raised a dark brow. If there were any true threat, physical or mental, I would disembowel them in a heartbeat with little effort. Nito gulped, and Sen shifted uncomfortably. Katsuki backed away, satisfied, after wrenching his dagger from the wood of the table. Hisashi finally turned to Izuku, drunkenly asking, y'alright? Ignore him, Katsuki said. Doubtful he'll remember this come morning. Would you like to retire early? Izuku was still too infuriated to even nod, so he instead stood as a response. Katsuki let him take the lead as he quickly exited the hall, disregarding the many eyes that stared at him and the hushed whispers that spoke of him. His guard glared down one particular gossiper, who promptly shut her mouth. The guards outside the hall's doors were startled to see them, but Izuku paid them no mind. He had enough control over himself to refrain from stomping, just barely. His white cloak and gown billowed around him as he walked quickly, wanting to get as far away from another person as possible. He wished it was Yagi following him, not Katsuki. He wanted nothing more than to be able to rant with no hesitation. They reached Izuku's tower in no time. He lifted his skirts as he stomped up the steps, Katsuki's armor clanging behind him. He paused at the top of the stairs, his chest heaving at how quickly he had ascended him. Katsuki's breathing hadn't changed at all, a testament to his stamina. Izuku rested one hand on the door to catch his breath. His guard did not speak, merely stood watching him in silence. The Omega turned to lean his back against the door, looking at Katsuki. He wished Ochako was here, but she was doubtlessly busy with the other servants, cleaning up the dinner. He was trying to slow his panting when a hand reaching out startled him. He quickly dodged it, glaring at the offender. Don't you dare touch me. Katsuki dropped his hand, looking sheepish. I apologize, Deku. I don't know how to comfort you. I don't need to be comforted, especially by you. And don't call me that. What am I supposed to call you, then? Do what everyone else does, Izuku retorted. Call me my title, since that is all that matters. The prize. Katsuki scoffed. That's beeping stupid. Izuku blinked at the curse. It's dehumanizing. Demoralizing. What just happened is proof enough of that. And you think Deku is any better? Izuku exhaled slowly, his heart beginning to stop pounding at last. Thank you for doing that, he said reluctantly. You didn't have to. Of course I had to. It's a standard occurrence to hear strange remarks when I leave the tower, Izuku admitted, which made Katsuki frown. Deku. Look, Izuku had never seen him at a loss for words before. Your skin is red. Do you feel very warm? That didn't seem to be what he originally wanted to say. Izuku could only nod. Let's get you into your chambers. Do you have water in there? Katsuki began to reach for the door. No, Izuku said suddenly. No, you can't go in there. It's not allowed. Don't be absurd, I'm your guard. Izuku moved to block the door with his body. Only my Omega servants can join me in there. Not even Yagi has ever been inside. That's ridiculous. No one will know. Yagi is sleeping before his night shift. Katsuki rubbed the back of his neck and groaned. Fine, then, come stand over here, by this window. With luck, there will be a draft. Izuku did as he was told. The summer night was not too cool. It rarely was this far south, but it was cooler than Izuku's skin and thus did the job. He allowed his eyes to close, lips parting to breath in the fresh air. Armor clinked as Katsuki moved to stand next to him, causing Izuku to jump. Katsuki chuckled. Hey, you startle easily. I swear, I'm going to stop wearing this bulky shit as soon as possible, so that should help. That's not allowed. You think I care? Yagi wears it every day without complaint. So does Tenya. Well, they're both too damn uptight. You shouldn't curse in front of me. Katsuki peered at him intently. Izuku shivered slightly under the attention. Do I make you nervous? No, I do, don't I? Izuku cut his eyes to Katsuki's face. He was still smiling, but it was now gentle, a simple curve to his lips. Should I be nervous? He whispered. Katsuki leaned forward, eyes locked on Izuku's exposed lips. I can't tell you how you should feel, sweetheart. Izuku's heart pounded at the term of endearment, the husky voice. It gave him an idea, though not an honorable one. Unable to help his curiosity, he reached out with his gift. And nearly fell out the window. He was hit with a tidal wave of the most intense pain he had ever felt, neither from himself nor from others. It ached fiercely, as though someone had carved a hole in his chest and left him alive to suffer in the aftermath. Izuku had to cut the gift off before he started shaking from it. He looked at Katsuki with a newfound wonder. What in the hell's happened in his past to cause such suffering? No person his age should feel anything close to that amount of pain. Katsuki was unfortunately very observant. A crease formed between his brows. What the beep just happened? Are you all right? I'm fine, Izuku insisted. He feigned a yawn. Just got very tired all at once. I should go to bed. He didn't believe him. It was obvious in his eyes. Katsuki lifted a hand, then dropped it. If you insist. He stared intensely, then gestured to Izuku's veil. Beep, I wish you'd take that damn thing off. That's not allowed, I know. He sighed. I want to know what you look like. You're not missing out on much. I highly doubt that. Katsuki kept staring as Izuku moved to the door. I'll stand guard until Yagi gets here. Izuku was too drained to protest, though he still might have if his door didn't lock from the inside. He stepped inside, resisting the urge to cast one more glance in his guard's direction. He took a moment to allow his hands to stop shaking before he began to remove his layers of clothing. First the veil, then his modest shoes, then the cloak, then his dress. It was hard to reach the fastenings of the gown. Usually, Ochako tended to them, but Izuku was flexible and determined. Next was his shirt and his undergarments, the latter of which he quickly replaced with a clean pair from his wardrobe. While there, he chose a light nightdress, his fingers lingering on the soft, slightly sheer fabric. He sat briefly to remove his socks, then moved to the wash basin. The water was cool from the drafty castle, which was refreshing when he splashed his face with it. As he dried off, he made eye contact with himself in the looking glass hanging on the wall. Green eyes, a rare hue, stared back at him, framed by dark green hair that was even rarer. A lovely face, the Duke said often, if not for the unfortunate half of it. Izuku turned his face slightly to the left, tracing a finger over the lines of raised flesh. The scars were jagged and darker than a normal scar, brown against Izuku's pale skin. There were 4 in total, all different lengths. They started past his temple, at his hairline, and extended diagonally down the left side of his face. 2 cut through his brow. The longest narrowly missed his eye and ended next to his freckled nose. The outer layer of his nightdress was sheer at the sleeves and skirt, showing more deep scars. More remained hidden on his back and torso. They were disgusting, a mark from his past that he will never escape. Katsuki would quickly regret lifting the veil were he to ever see them. He'd likely resign from his post as well. Izuku tried to convince himself that he wouldn't miss him. The careful movement of the needle was soothing to Izuku, who felt his eyes droop from the lack of sleep he'd gotten in the last week. He currently worked with dark blue thread, adding his favorite flower to the wreath on the circle of yarn. His hands were steady as he worked, ignoring the fact that he was willingly indulging in a hobby that was an Omega stereotype. "That is turning out well," Yagi remarked, looking over Izuku's shoulder at the design. "Are those moonflowers?" Izuku nodded, hissing as he accidentally pricked his finger with the needle. "Don't distract me, Yagi. I need to focus. I want this on my cloak, so I need to perfect it." Yagi backed away, hands raised. "I apologize, Your Grace." Izuku wrinkled his nose at the title, and Yagi laughed good-naturedly. He walked to the window, looking out of it in interest. "It is a beautiful day out." The Omega waited until he finished a stitch to respond. "It's too hot to enjoy. I would like to walk the gardens tonight, though, once it is cooler." His mentor nodded. "It has been some time since you have been able to, hasn't it? It is not me who will be guarding you after noon, though." Izuku sighed. "I know. Unfortunately, he's not so bad, is he? He's arrogant and vulgar, as I have said before. And brave, and strong, and in more pain than he should be," Izuku did not say. There was a pause in conversation as Yagi allowed Izuku to finish his design. Satisfied, he showed it to his mentor, who smiled and nodded in recognition. "That is beautiful, Izuku." "Thanks." Izuku was unable to suppress a yawn. "Tired. Still recovering from last week," Izuku said, referencing the shock of the Todoroki proposal and his discomfort with his new guard. Just then, the door to the room opened without warning. A servant stepped in, an Omega girl with big eyes and dark hair. Her arms carried a medium-sized basket. "Hello," she said cheerfully, nodding at Yagi. "I am Suyu. I was sent by the brewmaster to bring these potions. I wasn't sure where the prizes chambers are in this tower." "You can hand that to me, Suyu," said Yagi. She obliged. Yagi took it easily, despite his slim stature. The small vials clinked against each other as their possession was transferred. After she had long exited the room, Izuku exhaled. Yagi, after placing the basket on the floor, looked at him, or rather, at his veil. "I saw your father earlier today." He said nothing of the unfortunate events of yesterday evening. He truly was too deep into the wine. Izuku was perturbed. "Now, how in the hells do you know about that? Katsuki told you, didn't he?" Yagi shrugged, embarrassed. "Of course he did. You were threatened. I must be made aware of this." "I was not threatened." Izuku sighed, rubbing at his forehead from above the veil. "Monoma was just being cruel. Still, you should not have to deal with that. I am glad he told me." Izuku rolled his eyes. "Talk about me often, do you?" Yagi smiled. "There is not much else to talk about. He is surprisingly clever and observant, you know." "Shocking." Sighing, Yagi asked, "Are you upset with me?" "A little. I can make it up to you," the beta promised. "What say you to moving this furniture so we can practice some knife movements?" Izuku perked up immediately. They worked quickly to move the table and chairs to rest against the walls. Yagi unsheathed his sword, while Izuku reached into the hidden gap in his gown's skirts to reach the dagger strapped to his right thigh. Good, said Yagi. Make sure that you regularly practice unsheathing it. You want to be as swift as possible. Izuku nodded, then set his cloak to the side and took a defensive stance. His feet were shoulder-width apart. He held the dagger directly in front of his torso, his other hand raised. He rested his weight on the balls of his feet. Move your armed hand slightly to the left, Yagi instructed. Izuku complied. Better. Now, is it more beneficial to parry or dodge in this situation? Yagi asked. Parry, Izuku answered confidently. He demonstrated the motion. The low surface area and high density of a dagger make it easy to redirect a blow without the blade shattering. I am more dexterous, as well. Very good, Yagi praised. Let's go through the common movements a swordsman would use to attack a dagger wielder, and how to counter them. The physical activity was welcome. These trainings were truly the only change Izuku had available to him to work his body, and he used it to his full advantage. He struck quickly, sure to halt the blade mere inches from Yagi's flesh. Yagi did not hold back, to Izuku's satisfaction. Long gone were the days when his mentor played it easy for him. Eventually, Izuku pulled off an impressive move where he pounced on Yagi's arm as it swung a devastating blow, twisting so that he dropped his sword. Izuku immediately grinned at his mentor. Well done, Izuku, Yagi proclaimed. Izuku flushed. That was well done. Thank you, sir, Izuku responded, willing his cheeks to cool down. Yagi huffed. Enough of that, I was anointed a knight 3 decades ago. Izuku shrugged. It matters not to me. You teach me well, and that is what matters. You are a good student, Yagi admitted. You have come a long way in your skills since we started. That was years ago, Izuku pointed out. I would hope that I've progressed. You've progressed well beyond your time, my boy, Yagi assured him. It's harder for Omegas to build muscle. It has made this quite difficult. I am well aware. Yagi rubbed at his abdomen, his expression tense. This is only a testament to your determination and skill. I hope you understand that. I suppose, said Izuku. They only fought a couple of more rounds until Yagi grew winded. Izuku decided to move the furniture back to its original place, only after he put his cloak and veil back on. He first put his cloak and veil back on, Yagi helping him with the chains and the clasps. They had moved the couch and chair and were moving the table when a knock sounded from the door. Blue and green eyes, though hidden under the veil, met in panic. Before either could speak, the door opened, and Katsuki entered. He froze as soon as he took in the scene, allowing the door to slam behind him. What the beep? The blonde asked. Why are you both holding that? Izuku kept his mouth closed, unwilling to reveal to Yagi that Katsuki knew his voice. The prize felt cold, Yagi hastily explained. So we moved the table to the window so he could embroider in the sunlight. We were just moving it back. Izuku hid a smirk. It was a good excuse. It spoke to how Yagi's skills in persuasion matched those he had in combat. Together, they placed the table back down. Katsuki's hands were full with a serving platter filled with tea and crumpets. Yagi snagged a piece of the bread immediately, to Katsuki's irritation. These are supposed to be for him. Oh, he doesn't mind, Yagi said cheerfully. Right, Izuku shook his head. Why send you, instead of a servant? Katsuki moved to place the tray on the table. It is well past midday. I'm to take over your shift. Oh, indeed. Well, I suppose it is fine if I remain here for some time. Izuku bristled. He easily chose his adoration for his mentor over his desire to remain silent. Nonsense. Go rest. But, it has been a long night and morning, Izuku explained. Please, for my sake, go rest. He reached out with his gift, confirming that his mentor was winded and in pain. You need to drop those potions by my chambers, anyways. Ochako will be in there cleaning, she will know where to place them. Yagi looked at him for some time, then nodded. He raised a hand to pat Izuku's shoulder, then thought better of it given their company. He exited the room with the basket of vials, not before stealing another piece of bread. As soon as he was gone, Katsuki's demeanor changed from stoic to triumphant. He was devoid of armor today and was able to place his hand right over his heart in a dramatic gesture. "Oh, Deku, you flatter me. What, so eager to be alone with me?" Katsuki teased. Izuku rolled his eyes, safe from criticism beneath the veil. "Not at all. Why did you send Yagi away so quickly then?" The Omega had no answer. He could not reveal Yagi's injury to him. He merely took a seat in the chair. Katsuki laughed in success. He moved away from Izuku to the table, where he brushed his hand on the table before picking up the piece of embroidery fabric. "What kind of flower is this?" "A moonflower. They don't grow in the Brooklands, do they?" Katsuki shook his head, then smiled. "How kind of you to remember where I'm from." "Kindly shut your mouth." The guard laughed again. "Not a chance, especially since I now have something to hold over your head." "And what could that possibly be?" Katsuki ignored the question, instead saying, "Embroidery is a useless skill to be practicing." Izuku's jaw dropped at the insolence. "No, it is not. It takes time and skill, neither of which a lesser kingdom would have. It shows the prowess of Umbrangrad." "That's just ostentatious." Izuku scoffed, then properly looked at Katsuki. His long-sleeved gray tunic was tucked neatly into his dark leather breeches, which were in turn tucked into a sensible pair of boots. His attire showed off his body in a way Izuku had never seen before. Even without armor, he seemed strong, thick arms, broad chest, shapely thighs. His belt was tight, showing off his slim waist, and held scabbards for his sword and his dagger. He looked obscene. "What did you mean when you said you have something to hold over me?" Katsuki hummed, then smirked. "Why don't you tell me what you two were actually doing in here?" Izuku's heart skipped a bit. "Yagi already told you." "Ah, yes, the lie about moving this table to the sunlight." "It wasn't a lie. Then why isn't the wood warm?" Katsuki pointed out, triumphant. Izuku bit back a groan. The beta's observance was quite aggravating. "That is not your business." "Yes it is, I'm your guard. You're an annoyance." Katsuki chuckled. "You are feisty today. I like it. Didn't I tell you to shut your mouth?" "I will, and I won't snitch to your father, if you remove the veil." Izuku took a deep breath. The veil served multiple purposes. It kept the public from seeing what rightfully belonged to the king. It was white like the rest of his clothes to show his purity. It hid his ugly scars. It protected him from showing any emotion that would be unbecoming of the prize. To allow it to show his mouth had been a hard battle to fight, even with the need to eat and drink. "Absolutely not," Izuku declared. "Besides, you are not wearing your armor. That alone will give you punishment as well. I'll just put it back on. Yagi will back me up." "Yagi is asleep by now." They looked at each other, one face filled with mirth and the other frowning. "I don't need that shit, regardless." Izuku huffed. "You can't know that." "I do. No one lands a blow on me if I don't want them to." "They did at the tournament," Izuku pointed out. "You're not even healed yet. I let him get that blow in." "No, you didn't. I saw you. You were slowing down." Katsuki raised a brow. "Watched me closely, did you?" Izuku didn't answer. "I needed to lower his guard so I could knock away his weapon." "It worked." Izuku frowned again at that. It made sense, but he hadn't even considered it a possibility before. It had seemed so authentic, the way Katsuki had seemed to be getting exhausted during the fight. It worried him how well his guard was able to masquerade like that. "You didn't have to kill him like that," he said. "You had the upper hand at that point in the grapple, you could have just knocked him out." "He pissed me off," Katsuki explained shamelessly. "Said some things he shouldn't have." "What things?" "You don't want to know. Besides, that is not your business." Izuku rolled his eyes at the parroting of his earlier words. "Yes, it is. He was fighting over me. Doesn't matter, I won. You'll keep saying that until someone beats you." Katsuki smiled. "You know me so well already." After eating supper in the tower, Izuku reluctantly turned to Katsuki. "The sun has set." "Very observant," Katsuki said sarcastically. "I wish to walk the gardens, they're accessible from the base of the tower." Katsuki tilted his head. "Are you allowed to?" "Actually, don't answer that. I have a feeling you would say yes, whether it was the truth or a lie." Izuku held back his smile. It is allowed when I am guarded. Yagi takes me regularly. Katsuki gestured to the door. I'll follow you wherever you go. Izuku ignored the way his heart skipped a beat at those words, letting the door hit Katsuki behind him. It was a quick jaunt down the flights of the tower stairs. Katsuki stopped at a room towards the base of the stairs, in which he'd evidently stored his armor. He was quick to don it, though Izuku's legs still bounced with impatience. They exited the tower into the main castle building, Katsuki nodding at the guards, before turning to the nearby door that led outside. The summer air had a tinge of warmness to it but was far from unbearable. The large garden was enclosed by an iron fence and sprawled over the castle grounds, showing off all sorts of foliage. Katsuki opened the gate, allowing Izuku to step through. He turned right, following the curve of the path. The garden also housed several large trees to provide shade, and tall hedges to keep the flowers divided. Izuku ran his fingers along the hedges and the bark of the trees. He wished he could take his gloves off to truly feel them. He would have if it were Yagi here with him instead of Katsuki. He wanted to show as little skin to the arrogant guard as possible. He stopped at a few points to smell the flowers. They were colorful under the moon's light. Whoever kept the gardens had done well to keep them alive in the summer heat. They still had months to be blooming before beginning to close for winter. Katsuki's armor clanked as he walked behind him, a constant reminder that he was not alone. He had never been alone, truly. Even at night, in bed, someone always stood outside of his door. It was infuriating. Izuku wondered if his future husband, whoever it may be, would ever allow him to be solitary. It was a hopeful thought, though extremely unlikely. Izuku stopped at a patch of red roses nearby, looking at them appreciatively. I like roses. The sound of Katsuki's voice was a shock in the stillness of the night. Izuku looked at him briefly before turning back to the flowers. They're pretty. Not the most beautiful, though. No, I suppose they're not. It felt as though his eyes were burning holes in the back of Izuku's head. You must appreciate the color. Izuku hummed questioningly. You don't get to see a lot of it, Katsuki explained. You're shrouded in white cloth, surrounded by gray armor. Your meals are simple. The only real color you see is your yarn and this. He gestured towards his purple cape. Even your tower is not decorated. Izuku resumed his walk. It is meant to be modest, like I am. Katsuki laughed mockingly. Modest. Such a jest. You're clothed in enough silk to feed a poor family for weeks, if not months. Izuku flushed beneath his veil, the silk feeling heavy on his skin. Did you not say your embroidery is meant to be shown off? That's not until the future when I no longer have to wear all white, Izuku lied. When you marry? Katsuki asked. Izuku tucked his head and refrained from answering the question. Sensing his discomfort, Katsuki chose a kind redirection. It seems we're the only ones out here. People rarely come to the gardens at nighttime, Izuku explained since Katsuki had no way of knowing this. The cliff rises nearby to here, just beyond the city's walls over there. Izuku pointed to where the night sky looked hazy in the distance. Katsuki squinted. Is that fog? It's the mist. Izuku shivered slightly. The Crimson Woods, Katsuki realized. He didn't sound fearful. Infested with the cursed. I've never seen it before. I came to the city a different way. You can see them over the hills from my tower if you're at the right window, just a distant haze though. Try the northeast-facing one in the reading room. They turned a corner, and now in sight was the primary reason had come to the garden tonight. Both moons were full and shone down on the plants, allowing them to bloom and glimmer in the light. The dark blue petals reflected the moon's light in shimmers as if they had sparkles scattered across them. The leaves were a deep shade of green that wasn't seen on any of the surrounding plants. The stems, the same color as the leaves, were littered with small, sharp spikes. That's the flower you embroidered, Katsuki noticed as they approached. Moonflowers, right? Yes, Izuku whispered reverently. They only bloom when there is sufficient moon's light. They're my favorite. You track the moon phases, the guard realized. You knew they would bloom tonight. That's why you chose tonight to walk the gardens. Izuku bent his head to them. His veil was thin enough that he could smell them through it. They were aromatic, smelling like the stars and like something unplaceable. Something like home. Would you like me to pick some for you? Katsuki asked, already reaching for his dagger. No, Izuku said quickly, causing him to pause. No, please. They are rare, only grow in the south, and picky. The garden keeper must have amazing skills to keep them alive every year. They look like the ocean under the night sky. Katsuki sounded amazed as he looked at the petals. They're my favorite color. Wait, you've seen the ocean? The guard paused, then shook his head. Only paintings of it, Izuku hummed, accepting the answer. The leaves are my favorite color. Izuku's cheeks burned. They were a very similar hue to his eyes, not that he'd ever let Katsuki discover that. They stood there, admiring the flowers and the peaceful night, much longer than Izuku ever had. Yagi always steered them back inside, not wanting them to get in trouble for being out so long. Katsuki didn't seem to care. Never seemed to care about the rules, about what should and shouldn't be. Izuku hated how refreshing it was. One time, Katsuki said, spooking Izuku slightly, I fell into my father's flower bed. He was anal about its upkeep. It was springtime, the buds were mere days from blooming. I was beeping around, playing some game that I don't remember. Foot got caught, and down I went. Izuku snorted at the thought of a little Katsuki tripping into a bush. Katsuki smiled at the sound. I tried to go hide, but my father saw it happen. He forgave me instantly, but my mother was pissed. Poured rice on the ground and made me kneel on it. That beeping hurt. Izuku bit back a chuckle, then frowned. I thought you said your father is a bastard and your mother a whore. He did not know what that word meant, but it sounded bad. Katsuki looked at him. Yes, they were poor for a while, but they loved each other deeply. Izuku tried to picture it. He knew about romantic love in theory, had seen flickers of it in Ochako's eyes when she snuck glances at Tenya, but had never witnessed it in full bloom. That must have been nice. What? Being poor. Izuku ignored the tease. Having parents that love each other. Katsuki paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Did the Duke not love your mother? I don't believe so. Izuku chewed his lip nervously, oblivious to Katsuki watching the movement intently. He didn't know why he was telling him so much. He didn't even speak to Ochako or Yagi so openly. I don't remember much of her, honestly, before she died. Only her hair, really. Her smile. Izuku shook his head. She didn't smile much, or laugh. Like you. Izuku's eyes widened. Katsuki must look at him more frequently than he thought. I suppose. Things were very hard for her, though. Most days, she didn't even get out of bed. You're strong, Katsuki said, causing Izuku to turn to him in shock. You are. Things are hard for you, too. Yet here you are. Izuku shivered at the unexpected praise. No, things are not hard for me. I am guarded, never in danger. I don't have to worry about food or clothes. I have a stone roof over my head. I will never have to rule over land or handle finances. My life is one of ease. Katsuki sighed. Being imprisoned is never easy. Izuku looked at him, stunned and silent. It's what you are. You have food, but no say in what is cooked. You have clothes but are forced to wear that abhorrent cloak everywhere. You live in a castle you did not choose, and the gardens are the only outdoors you know. Your damn drunk of a father will marry you off for his own benefit to an alpha that you won't meet until your wedding night. Katsuki narrowed his eyes. You are strong just for resisting the urge to leap out the window at the top of your tower. Izuku's breathing hastened. Most of that is true for all Omegas, not just me. It shouldn't be. A gasp escaped Izuku's lips. Katsuki, you can't be saying these kinds of things. It's beyond disrespectful, it's treasonous. Katsuki was staring at the Omega's lips once more. Say it again. What? My name. That was the first time you've ever said it. Say it again. Izuku pursed his lips into a thin line, refusing. Katsuki groaned. Oh, come on. Just when I thought I was getting somewhere with you. Throw me a bone here, Deku. Do you want me to beg, Want me to get on my knees in the dirt? Izuku turned away sharply and started walking before Katsuki could do just that. He wouldn't put it past the outrageous beta. Deku. He jumped away, wheeling around as his hand reached for the gap in his skirts for his dagger. Gods! How the hells had Katsuki caught up to him so quickly without making any noise, especially in his armor? Gods! Katsuki echoed, looking genuinely surprised. Izuku cursed internally. You startled me. I meant God Sake. Just one. Obviously. Obviously. Izuku turned back to the castle. Are the walls echoing my words? Katsuki followed next to him, looking delighted. Was that a joke? Did you just joke with me? Izuku kept his mouth shut as his guard cackled the whole way back to the castle. Izuku walked the gardens every night for the next several days while the moons were still mostly full. Either Katsuki or Yagi walked behind him, depending on which of them was on watch that night. Izuku hated to admit it, but he preferred when Katsuki was with him, solely because he was then allowed to stay longer. He was careful now to keep his words to a minimum to the young guard. He spoke too much the first time. Spoke about his mother. It was unacceptable. Katsuki talked enough for the both of them. Questions aimed at the Omega, teasing him when he didn't answer. When they stopped at the moonflowers, however, he was solemn. The subject of his words became himself instead of his liege as he ran his fingers over the green leaves. Izuku learned that Katsuki loves oranges, but gives his apples to his horse without second thought. He learned that Katsuki is paler now than he's ever been, usually spending most of his time outside. He learned that Katsuki was an only child, with no siblings to grow up with. It was disarming to Izuku to listen to these things. He didn't want to know these random facts about his guard. It felt much too personal, too intimate. It was inappropriate, but there was nothing Izuku could do to shut him up. Nothing that wasn't violent. He sighed now, running his hand along the book spines of the shelf before him. The selection was meager, only histories of the kingdom and instructions on Omega etiquette. All things Izuku was forced to read again and again with the priestess. He longed for a novel, something similar to the stories Yagi tells him of his time as the Smiling Knight. Katsuki stood by the window, looking out every once in a while. The crimson woods were visible, which was likely what he was looking at. The mist would still be rising from the red trees, despite the rain falling. The storm was the reason Izuku was so disappointed tonight. It had started just after dinner, right before Izuku had planned to walk the gardens one more time before the moons were too waned. But now the clouds shielded the sky, and the flowers would not bloom tonight. Izuku looked at his guard. At least he wouldn't have to listen to him yammer. I wish to retire to my chambers now. Katsuki turned to him, surprised. It was the most the Omega had spoken to him all day. Are you certain? It would be an hour earlier than usual. Izuku nodded, his veil slightly bouncing from the motion. I am tired. The rain will put me to sleep easily. Very well. Katsuki looked out the window one more time before heading to the door. He opened it and peered out in each direction before holding it open for Izuku. This had been a recent development. Both Yagi and Katsuki one day started checking halls and rooms, except his chambers, before allowing Izuku to enter, as if in agreement. Izuku had no idea what they were looking for or why they had started now. Izuku ascended the stairs, with his guard following behind him dutifully. When they reached the top, Izuku smiled, hiding it from Katsuki. That's strange, Katsuki remarked when he saw the unlit lantern that hung from the ceiling. The wind of the storm may have put it out. It was an acceptable excuse. Stay here, I'll be back. Can't go anywhere else, came the drawled response. Izuku ducked into his chambers, seeking out a large chest in one corner. He dug through it for a moment until his gloved fingers brushed a small box. He pulled it out triumphantly. Back outside the door, Katsuki stood on his tiptoes to investigate the lantern. The wind isn't blowing in the direction it would have to for it to blow through this window. And the oil is still half full. How did it get extinguished? Izuku huffed lightly. He truly hated how observant the beta was. He made a mental note to talk to Yagi tonight about coming up with a new signal. Here, Izuku said, handing out the box of matches, careful not to let their fingers touch even through his gloves. He watched, jealous of Katsuki's height, as he struck a match on the first try and easily reached up to relight it. The flame caught quickly. He blew out the match, then tossed it out the window, Izuku grimaced at the littering but didn't speak up about it. He just thanked his guard, took the box, and hurried into his room. He took a moment to throw the matches back into the chest before he made haste to the wardrobe. He clawed through all the white fabrics until he reached the false back. It only took a pull of a hidden clasp to pop open, revealing the only dark fabric in the entire room. Izuku pulled out the pieces of clothing and a pair of boots, placing them on the couch. He took off his veil, cloak, and gloves and was struggling with the laces of his dress when his door opened without warning. Startled, he quickly sat on the clothes and threw the boots behind the couch, out of sight. A head of brown hair poked in, spotting him. Ochako came inside, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I wasn't expecting you." Izuku kept his face neutral. "I know." Ochako moved away from the door. "What are you doing?" "Oh, I just wanted to rest a moment before changing into my sleepwear." "Liar," Ochako whispered harshly. "This hurts, Izuku. I thought you knew you could trust me." His heart pounded. "I don't know what you're talking about. I spend more time here than the servant quarters. I know about the secret stairwell." She kept her voice at a whisper even though the door was much too thick for Katsuki to hear them. Beep. Izuku dropped his head, running his fingers through his curls. "Don't tell me anyone else knows." "Of course not," she claimed, then amended, "not that I know of. Some other servants may know if they cleaned your chamber pot properly." Izuku groaned. "You know I sneak out." "I sure do. I also know about you and Yagi's little signal." She tapped her head, then pointed at the ceiling. "You might want to change that up, by the way." Katsuki was investigating it. Maybe try cracking the door. Though, he'd probably notice that too. He would, and he would also likely search Izuku's chambers from floor to ceiling afterward. "Yes, I know. He is way too observant." Ochako sighed, then moved towards him. Izuku scooted over so she could plop down next to give. She hesitated, then grabbed Izuku's bare hands, causing him to jump. She had never before touched him outside of bathing him or brushing his hair. "Izuku, what am I to you?" He stared at her. You're my servant." She shook her head vehemently, brown hair flying around. "I'm your friend. I know you better than anyone does, except maybe Yagi. I've seen the dagger you wear on your leg. I shampoo your hair and clean your chamber pot. I literally wash your ass." She chuckled at Izuku's blush. "You can tell me anything. I won't tell anyone. I won't judge you or be upset at you. Except maybe if you told me you fancied Tenya." Izuku laughed along with her, a rare sound. "Don't worry, he's all yours." "Nah, I know who you actually fancy." She flicked her eyes towards the door. Izuku's cheeks got even hotter. "What? No, he's a narcissistic jerk." "You're into it," Ochako teased, jumping away when Izuku swatted at her. "Don't worry, it's mutual. Have you seen the way he looks at you?" "He does not." Ochako only smiled, wriggling her fingers at Izuku. "Come on, get up. I'll help you undress." Izuku flipped up the hood of his brown cloak as he reached the bottom of the hidden stairs. His hair was hidden beneath a cowl, but the hood still brought a welcome shadow over his face. The hidden door sealed itself behind him. Though, he thought, he may not need the shadow. Outside the tower, Yagi waited for him, with two distinct objects in his hands. He was dressed plainly as well, his distinctive yellow hair dyed dark with ink. "Sorry if I kept you waiting for long," Izuku said. "Katsuki held me up." He decided to not tell Yagi about Ochako. It would only worry him. "We need a new signal." "It is fine, my boy." Yagi reached out a hand with one of the objects. "Yes, I realized when I put out the lantern that Katsuki would definitely notice." Izuku took the object, a mask. He blushed as he studied it. It was a black bunny mask. It would cover his whole face except for his jaw and his eyes, which would be visible through the holes. "Aren't my eyes too distinctive? Green eyes are very rare." "It's fine," Yagi brushed him off. "People will notice, sure, but only myself and your servants know the prizes I color." Izuku shrugged, accepting it, then removed his hood to don the mask. The strap clasped shut at the back. He looked at Yagi and bit back a laugh. His mask was orange and equally as silly as Izuku's. "Here, kitty kitty. Enough." said Yagi, but he was smiling. Come, let's make haste. They walked quickly away from the castle towards the town, keeping to the shadows away from the main path. What little moonlight may have come from tonight's crescents were hidden behind dark clouds. Were there no other options? We look ridiculous. Where the hells are we going that we need them? The shop was wiped clean. They haven't been able to restock since most masks got bought up by the Todoroki host. Izuku nodded. That made sense. As for where we are going, he trailed off. Izuku was curious about what expression he wore under the mask. Do you know what gambling is? No, of course not. It is when people bet money on the outcomes of games. Where we're going, it's usually card games. Remember that game I taught you once? Yes, that was fun. I like card games. We're not there for fun, Yagi chided. Izuku's shoulders tensed. I know. Sorry. It's fine, Izuku. Actually, take care not to say each other's names when we're there. There will likely be many soldiers that know me or know of me. Izuku murmured his agreement. Yagi paused again, thinking. He grabbed Izuku's arm and tugged him to a halt. Izuku's eyebrows raised in surprise. They were usually in a hurry to do what they snuck out to do. My boy, gambling isn't the only thing that happens at this place. The building is called the Scarlet Corner. People do things there. With each other. What kind of things? Please, my boy, let me speak. Izuku smacked his mouth shut. They do things that you've never seen before. People touch other people in return for money. I can't tell you what exactly they do, only warn you. Please turn your head if you see folks very close to each other. Izuku pursed his lips. He was very confused, but he appreciated the warning. I'll look away, I promise. Very good. They resumed their jaunt, even quicker now to make up for lost time. Their target was tucked away at the edge of the city, close to the wall. It had no sign, only a large red banner. Several people entered and exited, noise and laughter drifting through the air each time the door opened. Yagi took a moment to grab Izuku's hand and latch it onto the beta's cloak. Stay close to me, and keep your gaze down. Izuku nodded in response, and they entered. The brief initial look at the inside of the Scarlet Corner Izuku was able to get overwhelmed him. It was packed to the brim with people, all masked. Several tables were scattered across the first floor where card games were played. In the back, there was a set of stairs that led to a second floor which was largely obscured by huge red curtains that were only slightly parted to reveal a couple of doors. Izuku turned his gaze down, his heart pounding. His skin itched where it touched. Members of the crowd threw their clothes as he brushed by them, following Yagi. He was led to the left side of the room, where, Izuku took a peek, there was a gaggle of mostly women. Yagi tapped one of them on the arm to get her attention. Izuku looked straight down when she turned. She was barely clothed. Izuku had never seen so much skin other than his own in his life. Excuse me. Yagi had to raise his voice to be heard over the clamor of the crowd. Can you please tell me where I can find a nice young lady named Summer? The girl, an Omega, laughed. How polite. So very rare in here. I can tell you where Summer is, but she's neither nice nor young. Please, young lady, our business is urgent. Her eyes widened behind her mask. Oh, it's you. Yes, please make haste. Go up the stairs, and turn left. You'll find her at the first door around the corner. Thank you, Yagi called after he was already moving, dragging Izuku behind him. It took much too long to get through the rambunctious crowd. The cacophony of noise had Izuku cowering. There were voices, music, and beeps. He had to raise his eyes to go up the steps and saw a couple in front of him, a male Omega leading a much older man behind him by the hand. Izuku stepped past them, hearing a strange beeping noise as he did. They turned left as they had been instructed, and went around the corner. There was a woman there, pacing in front of one of the doors. Her dark hair was wrapped in a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Only her upper face was covered by a red mask. The lower half was lined with age and worry. There you are, she exclaimed, then hesitated. How do the worthy die? With dignity and honor, Yagi answered back, and her shoulders relaxed. Please, come in. She led them into the room. It was small, but large enough to hold a two-person bed comfortably. Izuku raised a brow at the furniture. What use did a gambling venue have for a bed? Did anyone stay here long enough to need to sleep immediately? A quiet sob filled the room before the beta woman, Summer, shut the door. All of them looked at a crying girl in the corner with pity. She looked so young, maybe only a year younger than Izuku. Is it her? Yagi asked cautiously, a hand on the knife at his belt. Izuku did the same. No, not her, Summer said quietly. A small party of soldiers returned from the woods today, smaller than they were when they first left. Izuku cocked his head, confused. Why were soldiers being sent to the woods? It took longer to go around them, but worth it to avoid the cursed. This girl was hired by one of them for. Yagi coughed to cut her off, jerking his head towards Izuku. You know what I mean. She was able to see the bite on the back of his thigh when he turned around. The back of his thigh. Izuku wondered what he was doing that he had his breeches off for her to see it. I see, said Yagi. Where is the soldier? Sequestered, I hope. Summer pointed to another door in the corner of the room. That leads to the chamber pot, all these rooms have them. I put him in there. He's very scared. He will turn soon, I think. Last I saw him he was very pale and sweating a lot. He stopped speaking to me several minutes ago. Izuku nodded. It definitely sounded like he was about to turn. I'll go, he volunteered, speaking for the first time since entering the building. Yagi eyed him. Are you sure? He could turn at any minute. I should go with you. Izuku gestured subtly to the girl. She needs comfort. She could have been bitten, too, had he turned. You're much better at that than me. The beta considered it, then sighed. At least let me check the room first to see whether he's already gone. Izuku nodded his consent to the compromise, and they approached the room together. Summer had already moved to kneel next to the girl, shushing her. Both Yagi and Izuku unsheathed their daggers in preparation. Yagi quickly flung open the door and they peered inside. There was an unmasked man there, lying on the ground next to the chamber pot. He was panting, a sheen of sweat on his forehead beneath his mop of red hair. He wore a shirt, but had his breeches off, covered only by his small clothes. He beeped at the sound of the door opening. It was clear that he hadn't turned yet, but would very soon do so. Izuku stepped into the room, and Yagi closed the door behind him to block the view. The room was hardly big enough for Izuku to kneel next to the man, peeling off the mask as he did. He placed a hand on the man's face, wiping away some of his sweat with his sleeve. The man beeped again, attempting to lift his face. Mummy. Izuku's heart broke. No, I'm sorry, it's just me. I'm here to help. He immediately deployed his gift and felt just how sick this man was. Nauseous, a pounding headache, pain everywhere. Every part of his body hurt so much that the bite itself was discernible from it. The man probably just thought, or hoped, he was extremely sore. Izuku focused, and the pain doubled. Beneath him, the man slumped in relief as the pain left his body. His panting slowed. He was able to lift his head now, blinking wearily but sentient. Who? What? My name is Izuku, I'm here to help. He felt no hesitation to give his name since the man would not live long enough to tell anyone. What's yours? Frederick. Frederick, do you know what's happening? Do you feel any pain? No, it's all gone. How? His eyes got wide. I was bitten. No, beep, please. I can't turn into one of those things. Frederick trembled again, this time from the memory of his encounter with the cursed. Izuku shushed him, hoping he hadn't been loud enough to be heard by the others. It's all right, Frederick, it's all right. He lifted the dagger to show him the red blade capable of cutting the curse from his body. That's blood metal, isn't it? Frederick asked, stunned. I'm not going to hell. Izuku shook his head. Anyone who had already turned was said to have their souls sent to the one true hell in exchange for the curse taking over the body. I'm going to help you go to heaven. You'll be safe there. He didn't voice that he himself would rather go to the heavens. Fine, Frederick panted. Do it, please, it could happen any. Blood drained onto the white floor as Izuku pushed the blade through Frederick's back, in between his ribs to strike right at the heart. Death was instantaneous, just as he planned. Izuku let out a long breath as Frederick's pain left his body. He took a moment to wipe his dagger on a nearby cloth. He cursed under his breath as he noticed a spot of blood on the outside of his cloak. It was small but noticeable. They couldn't risk it, so he removed the cloak, balling it up in his fists so it wasn't visible. Izuku reached over the body, using 2 fingers to close Frederick's blue eyes. He stood, put the mask back on, and exited the room, closing the door behind him to block the view of the body. Yagi stood from where he knelt on the floor to meet him. "It is done. Are you well?" Izuku nodded. "I'm fine." And he died with dignity. Yagi's shoulders slumped in relief. "Thank the gods." Summer stood too. "Thank you both. I don't know how to repay you." The girl was still hunched over on the floor but was no longer weeping. "No repayment is necessary," Yagi said, brushing her off. "This is what we do. Do you require help to clean up?" Summer shook her head. "Come now, boy, we must go." Izuku followed him out of the room and shut the door behind him to give the 2 women privacy. Yagi made it just past the curtains before he stopped suddenly and retreated, eyes wide. He grabbed Izuku and kept him from going past the curtains. "Oh, gods, he's here, my boy. He cannot see you." "Who?" Izuku questioned, bewildered. He was still wearing the mask, no one could recognize him from just his eyes. "Unless. The Duke, he's right by the exit." Yagi shut his eyes, thinking hard. "It's fine if he sees me, many soldiers and commanders frequent here." "But you. He may be too drunk to notice," Izuku suggested. "Maybe. It's not likely though. He must have just arrived." Yagi hummed, tapping his hand on his belt. "That is a good thought, though. He probably will be too drunk to see at some point. I can help him get to that state with time. You can't be seen loitering though. Should I return to Summer?" "No, that's too suspicious as well. She cannot discover that you are the prize." Yagi gestured at the nearby doors. "Hide in one of the rooms, lock the door behind you. But listen first. If you hear noises coming from inside, choose a different door." Noises. Everything about this place was confusing to Izuku. Yagi cursed, looking embarrassed. Grunts, beeps, slapping noises. His eyes brightened. "Sounds you would hear in a hand-to-hand fight." Izuku nodded, still confused. If people were fighting in there, why was there a bed? "When I've gotten him drunk enough, I'll come get you." "Will he recognize you? You are masked and your hair is dyed." Yagi ran a hand through his blackened hair, then shrugged. "He will know my voice when I speak. As for my hair, I will merely tell him that I don't come here often, and wished to disguise my appearance so as to not draw attention to myself. Go now, my boy." He gave Izuku's arm a comforting squeeze as a send-off. Izuku took a deep breath and approached one of the doors on their side of the curtain's opening. He pressed his ear to the wood, listening intently. He heard nothing, so he nodded in Yagi's direction to confirm this room was where he'd be. Yagi nodded back before turning to descend the stairs. After hearing his father yell out Yagi's name, Izuku quickly entered the room, turning to face the door. He let out his breath, his heart beating fast. He sent a quick, silent prayer to the gods that Yagi would succeed and they would return to the castle undiscovered. Something creaked behind him. Izuku's eyes widened as a very familiar, very deep voice spoke. "Well, how interesting. What do we have here?" It was Katsuki. This was one of the worst people that could be in here. Maybe the worst, Izuku thought, as he sensed him approaching. Izuku's attire was tight, especially compared to the usual loose clothing he wore as the prize. He felt utterly exposed. Why was Katsuki even here? He was supposed to be guarding Izuku's chambers. Had he realized he wasn't in his room and come looking for Izuku? Izuku needed to leave this room immediately. He lifted a hand to do so. "Hey there," Katsuki whispered into his ear. Izuku jumped. His face had to be right next to Izuku's for his whisper to seem so loud. He, thankfully, did not touch him. Yet, a bunny, what a naughty little bunny, barging into rooms in a brothel without knocking. Could have found someone in a compromising position, huh? Izuku stared straight ahead at the door, unwilling to turn around. This was a compromising position. It was even more so when Katsuki reached up to lock the door. Izuku dropped his hand, too scared to try to escape. Don't want to talk, do you? I bet I can get you to talk. I'm used to getting people to talk. Izuku's eyes widened. Oh gods. Oh gods. He was talking about getting Izuku to talk. Did he know it was him? Why don't you turn around and take your mask off, Bunny? Izuku's heart swooped. Being called Bunny by the same voice that always addressed him as Deku was jarring, but it gave him hope. If Katsuki knew who he was, he would have called him Deku by now, right? Come on, be good. Let me see what I'm working with. Absolutely not. Izuku would not turn around. He would wait here until Yagi came knocking. Oh, hells, what would Yagi do if he saw them in here? He could not turn around. He could not let himself be touched. Izuku prayed that Katsuki was not the type of man to touch him without permission. But Katsuki was absolutely the type of man to touch him without permission. Give me something, darling. I'm dying over here. Please, let me touch you. Izuku shook his head vehemently. Darling. His skin tingled as he saw Katsuki lift his hands just fingers width away from Izuku's waist. Just your hips to start. Please. Katsuki's voice was smooth as silk and warm as melted butter. It was sinful in Izuku's ear. Just your hips for now, I promise. His hands crept closer. Izuku kicked the wood of the door in an attempt to stop their approach. It worked. Katsuki inhaled, frozen still. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I making you uncomfortable? Izuku nodded. We don't want that, do we? I want to make you feel good. Real good. Don't you want that? Izuku didn't answer. He couldn't answer. He didn't know his answer. His body was starting to tremble so hard that he was worried that he would be the one to initiate their first touch. The trembling didn't go unnoticed. You're shaking. Let me comfort you, Bunny. Don't you wish to be wrapped up tight, nice and warm like you're in a burrow? It did sound nice. Izuku was so starved of touch in his day-to-day life, other than from his father and Ochako. He knew Katsuki's arms would feel good around him, too good. He couldn't risk it, otherwise he might never leave even when Yagi came knocking. I'll hold you real close, Katsuki murmured. I'll remove that mask so you can rest your pretty head on my shoulder. Surely you must be tired this late at night. You can rest against me. I'll keep you safe. Just like he always did. This was Izuku's guard speaking such sin to him, though he seemed oblivious to whom exactly he spoke. Otherwise, there was no chance he'd be saying such things to him, to the prize. But Izuku was tired. Using his gift for as long as he had tonight drained him, and he wanted nothing more than to lay in the bed behind him. Can you please turn around? I want to see your eyes. Izuku closed those eyes tight. He could not let that happen. He may drown if he did. The leaves are my favorite color, Katsuki had told him in the gardens about the moonflowers. If he saw Izuku's eyes he would never stop talking about them. Katsuki's hands moved, slowly so as not to startle him. They traced the air around Izuku's body, hovering just above his shaking form, until they reached his head. He closed his fists except for the pointer fingers, using them to poke at the bunny ears that stuck up from the mask above the top of Izuku's head. You're so damn cute, even all covered up like this. Why won't you turn around for me? I've never wanted anything more in my life. Izuku feared he was starting to feel the same sentiment. Katsuki's voice melted his bones, threatening to turn him into a puddle. Why was he complimenting Izuku so heavily? Why was it so important to Katsuki that he turned around? Why did Izuku want to turn around? He drew a breath. Katsuki went silent as if he expected to hear him speak, then slumped his palms against the door when he didn't. Let me turn you around. Izuku felt his walls start to crumble. Let me take care of you. The cracks spread. Please. The walls fell. Izuku nodded. Katsuki made a triumphant sound, immediately moving his hands to grab at Izuku's hips. His fingers were warm, even through the fabric of Izuku's trousers. He took a moment to appreciate the soft flesh of Izuku's round omega hips under his hands before slowly spinning him. Katsuki's face was unmasked and his eyes were lowered, looking at where his fingers squeezed Izuku. His gaze slowly traveled up, making detours to his legs and arms, lingering briefly in curiosity on the dagger visible at Izuku's belt. It felt like his gaze was touching him. Like it was caressing him. It lingered for several moments at his chest. Izuku blushed bright red. Without his cloak, his shirt showed way too much. It was his least favorite because of how much skin it exposed, but his others had been dirty. The neckline hung low, slightly exposing the shallow valley that split his chest. Katsuki stared even longer at Izuku's neck, which was also bare. It was quite slim, even for an Omega, and pale from being constantly covered. His gaze traced his jawline, which the mask didn't cover, in both directions, before jumping to Izuku's eyes. They stared at each other through the mask, eye to eye for the first time. Katsuki was speechless for several moments, while Izuku was breathless. Katsuki's eyes looked like twin blazing black fires, fully dilated and roaring and burning everything they looked at. Izuku felt like he was burnt by them, his skin itchy and red from being so thoroughly gazed at despite being mostly hidden beneath his clothes. Katsuki was careful to be slow and keep their eyes locked when he moved one hand from Izuku's hips to grasp his bare hand, the free one that wasn't holding the cloak. He lifted their hands to align their palms, showing off the difference in size. Izuku's fingertips didn't even reach Katsuki's second knuckle. His fingers were shifted as Katsuki interlocked them with his own, their skin sliding against each other sensually. Katsuki finally spoke. "Green. Your eyes are green." He smirked and Izuku's heart swooped again. "My favorite color. You're just perfect for me, aren't you?" Izuku felt far from perfect. His hand trembled in Katsuki's grasp, his face burned underneath the mask. He didn't know how much more of this he could handle. Katsuki wasn't even blinking. Izuku had to close his eyes. Why was Katsuki here, in the scarlet corner? Why was he acting like this? "No, don't hide from me," Katsuki cooed, moving his other hand from Izuku's waist to his neck. His thumb pet at the skin there, rubbing soothing circles that only made Izuku burn hotter. "Open those gorgeous eyes, please." "I wasn't done looking at them." Izuku screamed internally. This was deranged. This was wildly inappropriate. He opened his eyes, beeping in a breath at the way Katsuki's face lit up. "Thank you, darling. Keep them open for me, would you?" "There you go." Izuku panted. The room was getting hotter. "You look like sin. Your body is making me go beeping mad." Izuku took the chance to break their intense eye contact and look at Katsuki's own body. His black pants were wickedly tight, hugging his muscular legs. They were cinched around his trim waist with a belt exposed by his tucked-in tunic. The tunic was so tight Izuku thought he could see the outline of his abdominal and large pectoral muscles. His forearms were exposed by the rolled-up sleeves, showing off hands with prominent veins, free of scars or blemishes. Biceps flexed under Izuku's gaze, causing him to gasp lightly. His arms were absurdly thick, unspeakably strong. By the time Izuku's eyes returned to Katsuki's, the latter was breathing harder. "Trying to undress me with your eyes?" He laughed when Izuku shook his head hard. "That's all right, I know I sure am. I can't believe you're letting me touch you like this. Show me more of your skin." He moved the hand that was still on Izuku's hip to the neckline of his shirt, starting to pull the fabric away to expose more pale flesh. Izuku panicked. He tensed up, suddenly feeling infinitely more uncomfortable. Katsuki was about to see one of his scars. He dropped the cloak and quickly lifted his hand to slap it hard across Katsuki's cheek. His head whipped to the side under the blow, staying there momentarily before slowly turning back, sporting a red mark. He looked right into Izuku's eyes as he allowed a slow grin to split his face. "Oh, Bunny, you have no idea what you just did to me." He fell forward with a groan, startling Izuku as his head hit the wood of the door above Izuku. Beep. "Do that again." What in every hell was he saying? Izuku had hit him hard, much stronger than he looked like he could. His confusion must have shown in the lines of his body because Katsuki leaned back to look at him. "Come on, you little minx. Show me your violent side." Izuku refused. If Katsuki wanted him to do something, he would not do it. Katsuki dropped Izuku's hand and moved both of his to Izuku's waist. His fingers almost touched due to the size of his hands and the slimness of Izuku's waist. They did touch when Katsuki squeezed, nearly forcing a yelp out of Izuku. Look at this. Look at how my fingers touch. Look at how we're made for each other. Izuku wanted to close his eyes again. Katsuki stared at him like he wanted to eat him. Come here. Katsuki dragged Izuku along with him by the waist as he stepped backward. Towards the bed, Izuku realized with a knot in his stomach. Once the bed hit the backs of his legs, Katsuki sat down and eagerly tugged Izuku forward to stand between his spread thighs. His hands moved, one to his neck and the other to the back of his head, to make room for his knees to hug Izuku's waist. It was the most intimate position Izuku had ever been in. Can I take this off, bunny? Katsuki pleaded, thumbing at the cowl over Izuku's head. Izuku shook it, refusing to reveal that his hair was also green. How about this, then? He rubbed the mosque strap before hooking a finger under it, pulling it back before suddenly releasing it with a snap. Izuku jumped and Katsuki laughed meanly. Show me that beautiful face, Izuku shook his head again. Seeing his scars could very well make Katsuki leave the room in disgust, which was the last thing Izuku wanted. He wouldn't be surprised if Katsuki recognized his lips, either. Removing the mask out of the question. Candlelight flickered from the corners of the small room. It danced on the exposed skin of Katsuki's forearms and neck. Katsuki noticed him watching it and grinned. Want to see more? Back up for just a moment. Izuku let himself be pushed back a few steps to make space for Katsuki to take his shirt off. Izuku's heartbeat pounded so hard he couldn't hear what Katsuki was now whispering to him after he tugged him back in. This was the first time Izuku had ever seen a naked torso other than his own. Even in the training yard, the soldiers weren't allowed to remove their shirts, since the yard could be seen from some of the rooms in Izuku's tower. His skin was clear and unscarred, glowing in the candlelight. His chest was different than Izuku's. Both carried a pair of swells, but Katsuki's were from hard muscle. Izuku's were just from the soft curves of being an omega. His dark nipples were tucked under the mounds, barely visible. His upper arms looked even bigger than they did when they were covered. The largest parts were thicker than Izuku's thighs, which were far from slim. His abdominal muscles were prominent, forming shadows where they swelled and ebbed. Izuku blushed red-hot at the thought that crossed his mind. Katsuki was as muscular as an alpha should be. The only one Izuku had been allowed to be alone with, was his father, who was somewhat muscular only due to his biology. He never trained in the yard or lifted heavy bags as the soldiers and servants did. He was nothing compared to the beta before him. The most he lifted was his cup of wine to his lips. Speaking of lips, Katsuki's were still moving. Izuku snapped his eyes to Katsuki's and suddenly he could hear again. You back with me? Izuku nodded in response. Good. Thought I lost you there for a moment. Do you need me to repeat myself? Another nod. I said that it's all yours to do what you please with. I mean it, baby. You can do more than just stare. You can touch, you can bite, you can lick. I'll take it all. Oh gods. Lick, lick. Izuku lifted his hands to cover his eyes, resisting the urge to scream into them. He was going mad. No, don't do that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. Warm hands gripped Izuku's wrists and tugged gently. Move your hands, please. Izuku sighed and stopped resisting, allowing them to be removed from the mask. Katsuki smiled genuinely. I'm sorry, darling. Is it too much for you? Izuku nodded. It's all right. You're all right. Come here. Katsuki let go of his wrists, lifting his hands to either side of him, and offering a hug. Izuku waited several moments to ensure he was serious before slowly, very slowly, leaning in. It felt as good as he thought it would. Better, really. Katsuki's bare arms were unthinkably warm when they closed around Izuku's trembling form. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths against Izuku's heaving one. His large hands rubbed soothing circles on his back, gently working through knotted muscles. Even sitting on the bed, Katsuki's head was equal with Izuku's, so the latter could rest his cheek against a large shoulder. It felt nice, safe and secure, warm and intimate. Izuku cursed at the way his eyes welled up at the feeling. He wouldn't let himself cry in front of Katsuki. Oh, but he couldn't even remember the last time he was hugged. Probably by Kota several years ago, when he left for the citadel. He didn't imagine those hugs could even compare to this one, though. The tears didn't fall, but a small sob escaped his mouth. "Oh, baby." Katsuki sounded genuinely sympathetic. "Shish, it's all right. You're safe with me. I'm right here. I'm always right here. Breathe for me." Izuku did, taking a deep breath in and breathing it out slowly through his nose. "There you go, you're doing so well. Want me to kiss it better?" Izuku's eyes widened, alarmed. A kiss. Only his father and brother had ever kissed him. He shook his head, tensing up. Katsuki could feel it under his hands. "No, don't panic. It's all right. It's not a big deal. It doesn't even have to be on your lips. Here, give me your hand." Izuku did so reluctantly after ending their embrace. "Thank you. You can trust me. You can always trust me." He raised Izuku's hand to his face, stopping just a breath away from his shapely lips. He kept his eyes locked with the Omegas, searching and pleading for permission. It took many minutes for Izuku to nod finally. Katsuki moved his head forward slowly to make contact. The first kiss could hardly be called that, his lips barely brushing the back of Izuku's hand to test the feeling. The next was harder and longer. The third was a true kiss, the puckered lips beeping at his skin, setting it on fire. Katsuki's eyes fluttered shut in ecstasy and he beeped at the feeling and the taste. He moved his mouth all over Izuku's hand, kissing his knuckles and his fingertips. Izuku jumped when he reached his palm, the movement of his lips tickling the skin there. Katsuki only smiled and moved along to Izuku's inner wrist. His heart pounded. Katsuki's lips were right above the scent gland there, rendered useless and scentless by the potions Izuku drank every morning by the Duke's command. He wondered if Katsuki would like how he smelled. He was yanked from his daydreams as something soft and wet touched his wrist. He looked to see Katsuki maintaining intense eye contact while licking his skin. Oh, gods be good, he'd be able to taste Izuku if the gland was working. Katsuki finished the lick with a smirk before bending down again to press his teeth into the skin. Izuku jumped, alarmed, causing Katsuki to squeeze his hip with his other hand and press a kiss to his wrist in apology. "Sorry, bunny, I won't bite if you don't want me to." Izuku sighed, relieved. He couldn't handle that. Did the rest of it feel good? A nod. "That's good. I'll keep making you feel good, anywhere you want." Izuku's heart dropped then stood back up again, beating even faster than before. Where else would he? "Come closer," Katsuki commanded softly, tugging at his hand and hip. They were close enough that Izuku could feel Katsuki's breath on his neck. "Tell me where you want my mouth. Come on, tell me." Izuku's legs almost gave out. Is that what this was? As all of it just a ploy to get him to speak? His brow furrowed in anger as he stepped back. It must have shown in his eyes because Katsuki's face dropped. "What's wrong? What did I beep up?" "No, baby, please don't leave." Beep. Izuku looked him right in his eyes, hoping his message was conveyed as he slowly, deliberately shook his head. "I understand. I hear you loud and clear. I won't ask you to talk again. I promise you." Katsuki looked so earnest that Izuku couldn't help but soften. "There you go. Thank you. I don't deserve you." Wrong way around, Izuku thought. Katsuki lifted his hand from Izuku's wrist, letting Izuku's hand drop to his shoulder. Izuku cursed himself for letting it rest there, tracing the hard muscle with his fingers. Katsuki hummed at the feeling before reaching up to Izuku's neck, which burned bright red. "You've got such pretty skin, such a pretty neck," Katsuki whispered. "It's so thin. I bet I can fit my hand around the whole thing. Can I try?" Izuku shook his head, causing Katsuki to sigh in disappointment. "All right, I won't this time." This time, he spoke as if he planned to steal Izuku away and keep him forever. Izuku flinched when Katsuki's fingers tapped against his neck, demanding his attention. The look in those deep brown eyes staring back at him made Izuku feel wanted, feel cherished. It was addicting. "I want to try something." Katsuki's eyes searched Izuku's body for any tension. "I want to kiss you somewhere else." He stared intently at Izuku's neck. His neck. Katsuki wanted to kiss his neck, where the skin was even more sensitive than his wrist. It tingled under his gaze. Izuku closed his eyes and let out a shuddering breath, needing a few moments. Darling. He opened his eyes at the husky tone. There you are. I want to kiss your skin again. Please. Against his better judgment, against the will of the gods who were likely screaming down at him in horror, Izuku nodded. Katsuki slumped forward, immediately seeking out sensitive flesh. Gone were the slow, gentle kisses that were given to his wrist. His lips were greedy now, moving hungrily over every bit of his neck. He focused under each ear where 2 scent glands throbbed, painting a map between them with his tongue. He beeped hard on them like he was trying to draw the scent out by pure will, nearly causing Izuku to cry out at the sensation. His hands were hot where they grabbed all over Izuku's body. They squeezed his arms, his waist, and both of his thighs, like he was trying to map his figure. Every once in a while a sharp tooth accidentally flicked at his skin, causing him to gasp every time. Katsuki beeped at each of his glands one more time before lowering his head, moving down towards Izuku's chest. The thought of him kissing there made his stomach tighten and an unfamiliar warmth pooled between his legs. Katsuki kissed and licked and beeped at every inch of the skin exposed by the low neckline. Izuku felt like he was being devoured by a feral animal. Katsuki looked feral when he glanced up during one particularly deep beep to stare into Izuku's eyes. As feral as a beta could look, anyway. He maintained eye contact as he moved his hands from Izuku's sides to reach up slowly. Izuku gasped much too loudly as Katsuki laid his hands on the small mounds of Izuku's chest. Katsuki beeped at the feeling of them, releasing his mouth from Izuku's skin with a lewd pop so he could sigh dreamily. He didn't squeeze yet, he just let his hands rest on the softness. Once Izuku seemed to have calmed down a bit, he moved his fingers, gently pressing down as if to check the softness from every angle. He then rested his palms on the outsides of the swells, thumbs inching towards the center. His gaze was blistering when he purposefully brushed Izuku's sensitive nipples. Izuku nearly yelped right there and then. He had to reach under the mask to bite down on his own hand to hold back the noise, eyes stinging at the pain. No, don't do that to yourself. Katsuki reached up with one hand to tug Izuku's away. Not when you can do it to me instead. He pressed down again with the thumb still on Izuku's chest, right on his nipple. Izuku gasped, about to bite his hand again when Katsuki thrust his hand under the mask and into his mouth. Izuku had no choice but to bite down on it so hard it must have hurt, fighting to keep his beeps from slipping from his throat. Katsuki smirked before working his lips against Izuku's collarbone again, moving his thumb repeatedly. It sent tingles to every part of his body, flitting about before pooling between his legs. That area twitched as if that was what Katsuki was rubbing at instead of his nipple. It was far too much. Izuku threaded the fingers of both hands into Katsuki's blonde hair, grasping at the strands in an attempt to push his face away. Katsuki resisted easily, beeping at the feeling of his fingers on his scalp. He paused his lips' movements to say, "That feels good. Pull harder, please, beep. You won't harm me." Izuku let go of his hair in defiance, surprised he had any fight left in him. Katsuki groaned in disappointment, giving Izuku a heated glare before moving his face in front of the free side of his chest. Izuku realized what he planned to do, scrambling to push his head away, but it was too late. Katsuki swooped in with an open mouth to lave the fabric with his tongue. It lapped again and again, wet with saliva that soaked through the fabric and caused the nipple to tighten into a small bud. Izuku's chest heaved as he bit down even harder, hard enough that his teeth broke the skin of Katsuki's hand. Katsuki quickly moved his hand out of his mouth before the blood could hit his tongue, and Izuku petted his hair in an apology. He gripped the strands tightly again as Katsuki started to beep, his thumb still moving on his other nipple. He beeped hard, once, twice, then popped off, his lips red and swollen from using them so much. "You taste so good, bunny," Katsuki said, licking his tongue over his lips crudely. "I just want to eat you up. Make a big bowl of rabbit stew, He laughed at the bewildered look in Izuku's eyes. "I'm only jesting." He finally stopped groping Izuku's chest, moving both of his hands back to his waist, squeezing the flesh there to make his fingertips touch again. "You're so gorgeous. This waist is unreal. I want to hold it forever. I can't wait to see how beautiful the rest of you is. Izuku blinked back tears at the knowledge of how wrong Katsuki was. He was scarred, marked by the most ugly creature in all the lands. Izuku shuddered at the thought of Katsuki's lips curling in disgust at the sight of the scars that littered his body. Katsuki took the shudder as a sign of pleasure. That's it, baby. You're doing so good for me. Still feeling good? Izuku nodded. Good. I'm going to make you feel even better now. I want to watch you come apart for me. He began to lower his head back to Izuku's chest, his hands sliding across his legs, moving inwards towards where Izuku felt the hottest. The doorknob jiggled, causing Izuku to jump and Katsuki to freeze. Izuku clasped a hand over the mosque's mouth. He was suddenly pulled out of the moment and thoroughly disgusted with himself. What in the hells had he done? He felt tainted now, impure. He tried to step away but Katsuki held him tight by the backs of his legs, his grip still so strong even after all he had done to Izuku. Katsuki waited, looking at the door until a knock sounded from it. Izuku looked at him with wide eyes. Yagi. It had to be Yagi. He had come to get him. He could not see them together in here. Izuku looked around wildly, spotting the small door in the corner of the room. He shook Katsuki for his attention, pointing to the door and gesturing for him to go to it. Katsuki just hummed, listening intently to the main door, then leaned forward to put his mouth on Izuku's clothed nipple again. Izuku gasped quietly in disbelief at the audacity. Katsuki grinned against his shirt, mouthing at it, as his hands resumed their path. Katsuki, are you still in here? They both stilled at the voice, Katsuki huffing in annoyance while Izuku sighed in relief. It was not Yagi. I thought you said you would leave the door unlocked for me. It was a male voice belonging to someone who knew Katsuki. Now that he knew what kind of things went on behind closed doors here, Izuku felt himself bristle with jealousy. Was Katsuki supposed to be doing this with that man instead? Katsuki squeezed his thighs reassuringly, placing one more kiss on the center of each mound on his chest, before barking out a reply. I locked it because I'm busy, you imbecile. Go away. Oh. Izuku flushed and Katsuki chuckled fondly at the embarrassed look in his eyes, then whispered just to him, it's all right, sweet thing. He'll be gone soon. I'm sorry, but it's urgent. You need to come now. Katsuki looked furious. I just beeping told you, Eijiro, I'm busy. The beeping building could be on fire and I wouldn't leave this room. Izuku dropped his masked face in his hands for a moment. How did Katsuki say such embarrassing things so shamelessly? Sorry, Kat. Izuku rolled his eyes at the nickname. You really need to come. Now. It's of utmost importance. Katsuki groaned, letting his head fall forward to rest between the small mounds of Izuku's chest. Beep, he muttered, squeezing at the backs of Izuku's upper thighs, dangerously close to where the base of his back swelled with muscle and flesh. Shit, I'm so sorry, baby. The last thing I want to do is leave you right now, but I need to. He called out louder, just give me a moment. He lifted his head to press a quick kiss to the very center of Izuku's chest, marking a trail of kisses all the way up to the top of his neck as he stood, causing Izuku to step back. Katsuki kept his back curved to allow him to nuzzle into Izuku's neck, all gentle kisses now. He kissed at each ear and the top of his head through the cowl, moving Izuku's head around as he pleased. He kissed the ceramic of the mask, the forehead, each cheek, and the little bunny nose painted in the center. Looking deep into his eyes through the holes in the mask, Katsuki leaned in once more, keeping his eyes open to maintain intense eye contact as he kissed the mask's hard lips. Izuku let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Stay right here, he demanded, pinching Izuku's arms a bit too harshly. I mean it. Do not run away. I'm going to leave the room and you will stay and lock the door behind me. Get in the bed, nice and snug under the covers. Take a quick nap if you want to. Don't open the door for anyone except for me. Listen for my voice. I'll be back in no time, and I'll give you a real kiss, on each pair of lips. Each pair of lips. His mind must have been more scattered than he let on, Izuku thought. He must have meant to say on each lip. Izuku still blushed at the thought. Bunny. His gaze snapped back to Katsuki. Promise me you won't leave. I know you won't say it with your voice, but I need you to promise me. I'll die otherwise. Izuku bit back a laugh at his dramatic declaration. He brought his hands to either side of Katsuki's face, squeezing reassuringly just as Katsuki had done to him. He nodded definitively. Katsuki's tense shoulders slumped in relief. All right. Beep. I'll return as soon as I possibly can. He retrieved his shirt from the floor and threw it on. With every step Katsuki took towards the door, he shot a distraught, longing glance at Izuku. His feet moved as if made of stone, dragging on the floor. When he made it to the door he turned once more, looking as though he was going to change his mind and run back to him. Izuku gestured to the door, nodding encouragingly. Katsuki's face hardened, and he turned, yanking the door open and shut behind him with furious force. Izuku heard a man's voice say, "Who was that?" before the door slammed shut. Izuku believed Katsuki when he said he would return as soon as possible, which was why he made haste to check himself in the mirror in the corner of the room. He looked thoroughly debauched, his clothing rumpled, his mask askew, his chest red and bruised in some places where Katsuki's mouth had beeped too hard, his tunic damp with sweat and Katsuki's saliva. Izuku had no choice but to wear the cloak again, so he pulled his dagger from its holder as he approached the cloak. He worked quickly to cut the blood-stained cloth with his blade, relieved when he finally sliced through the last thread. Brushing off his clothes and donning the cloak, he checked one last time in the mirror to make sure he looked more normal. He bounded to the door, pulling it open only to run into a tall body. His heart stopped as he glanced up in fear of seeing Katsuki there. It was not Katsuki, it was Yagi with a surprised look on his face. "Oh, good timing. You must have heard the commotion down there. Your father passed out and fell out of his chair," he said, turning and gesturing for Izuku to follow him. "Yes, I heard it," Izuku lied, his face burning. He pleaded with the gods that Yagi wouldn't see right through him. "Stay close to me, and keep your head down." Izuku let out a long breath, relief blooming in his chest. His aching, bruised chest that was still wet from Katsuki's mouth. Gods, Ochako would lose her mind when she saw the bruises. The trip back to the castle was a quick and quiet affair, both having long since shed and destroyed their masks. Yagi attempted to engage him a few times, but Izuku deflected him by stating how tired he was. "Yagi," Izuku sighed exaggeratedly after Yagi asked him yet again why he was so quiet. "I truly am exhausted. I had to kill a man who called for his mother as he died after using my gift on him for far too long. I had to hide from my father for an anxious amount of time in an unfamiliar place. I do not wish to speak now." Yagi paused, regarding him carefully. "My apologies, my boy. I merely want to make sure you are all right. I am sorry about how tonight played out." Izuku grimaced, resisting the urge to rub at the bruises on his neck and chest. "So am I." To Izuku's slight surprise, Ochako was waiting for him in his chambers. The climb up the stairs of the servants' entrance had drained him even further, so he was unprepared for his shoulders to be grabbed as soon as he passed through the chamber pot room into his main chambers. "Izuku," Ochako whispered fiercely, "you were gone for much longer than I expected. I was so worried. Are you all right?" Izuku shrugged off her hands, heart twisting at her resulting expression. "I'm fine, Ochako. You really shouldn't have waited for me. Your presence in my rooms at this hour will not go unnoticed." Ochako frowned as she followed him to the couch. "Of course, I had to. I was worried about you. You were gone for a while." He glanced at her skeptically, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't carry through the wooden door. "I know you discovered I've been sneaking out, but how would you know how long I am usually gone for?" She blushed, then sighed. "Fine, that's only half of the reason. It may also be because Tenya is standing guard right now." Usually, Izuku would chuckle. Now, however, he feels no urge to tease Ochako for her crush. Instead, he perked up at the information. "I thought Katsuki was standing guard tonight. Some time ago Tenya came here. To relieve him, I presume," Ochako explained quietly. Izuku began to remove his boots, frowning at how muddy they were. It was impossible to tell what they said through the door, but I recognized their voices. And I was able to hear one of them leave, and the cape that remained was gold. So it was Tenya who remained, Izuku concluded, his voice carefully neutral. Wait, how did you see the cape? There's a slight gap under your door, she explained sheepishly, causing Izuku to scoff and look at the floor. He had not noticed how muddy his boots had been, since all of the floors at the Scarlet Corner had been filthy. Now, though, the tracks he had left in his chambers would be suspicious. He made his way to the basin, grabbing a cloth and wetting it to scrub the floors. Stop that, Ochako hissed. I'll take care of it. We must bathe you first. Here, I'll draw a bath and help you undress. No. Both of their eyes widened at his sudden yell before looking at the door, waiting to see if it would be knocked upon. The outburst seemed to have gone unnoticed, thankfully. Izuku's shoulders slumped in relief. With a much more quiet voice, he said, No, I am much too tired for a bath. It is very late, as well. You should leave now before it is too suspicious to ignore. Or before Katsuki may return, Izuku thought but did not say. Ochako scowled and tried to take the rag from him, though he hid it behind his back. If your boots are that dirty, the rest of you must surely need to be cleaned. That much I know, even without knowledge of what you did all night. The last thing Izuku wanted her to know was what he was doing all night. Ochako, please, I cannot tell you any details of what I was doing. I can only tell you that I don't wish to be washed by you tonight. I wish to sleep, and bathe myself in the morning. I'm only trying to help you, Ochako pleaded. I'm your friend, remember. A friend would know when to leave it alone, Izuku snapped quietly. Ochako gasped at his unexpectedly harsh tone, causing him to squeeze his eyes shut in regret. I didn't mean that, I'm sorry, Izuku drew a breath, steadying himself. I was wounded tonight. It was not serious, I assure you, but I wish to keep you from seeing it. It was not a lie, entirely. The bruises on his chest were, strictly speaking, wounds, and he very much did not want Ochako to see them. Ochako pursed her lips. I am not a healer, I suppose. Are you sure you can wash yourself, though? With those wounds? Izuku nodded. You of all people know that I am no stranger to being wounded. It was a low blow, but it did the trick. He saw Ochako's eyes flick to his facial scars, then to his back, before she grimaced. She chose to pursue a different line of questioning. I must know more of this secret stairway. I have not yet descended it. Where it leads to, is it secure? Could someone with ill intentions come here? Izuku blinked, then thought carefully of his response. It leads outside, he said, somewhat truthfully. I can only say that it is indeed secured, though I can't explain how. I'm sorry, Ochako. I do trust you, but there are some things I am just not permitted to share with anyone. So please, let me bathe and dress myself alone until I seek you out again. Ochako finally nodded after a few moments. You are right, then. I shall leave at once. Wait, Ochako, Izuku whispered to her. It is still so late. How would you excuse it? It is not unprecedented, she reminded him. You have had trouble sleeping in the past. If anyone asks, I will simply say that I was committed to doing anything I could to comfort the prize through his night terrors until he finally entered a peaceful slumber. Izuku could only nod appreciatively. I suppose Tenya would believe any excuse you provide, no matter how outlandish. Ochako narrowed her eyes at him in light-hearted annoyance before slipping out of the door. Her muffled voice was heard in a brief conversation with the night before silence enveloped the chambers. Izuku sighed, finally able to hang his head in his hands and rub at his eyes. Despite his fatigue, he felt the need to scrub every bit of his skin, every tile of the flooring, every thread of his clothes. He did so to the best of his abilities, starting with the floors, ignoring Ochako's insistence that she would take care of it. He used as little water as possible, draining the muddy liquid into the chamber pot to hide it. Once the stone was clean enough to pass as averagely dirty, he buried the rag under the other dirty linens in the appropriate basket. He stripped and added his clothing to the basket, trusting that Ochako would clean them discreetly. Izuku filled the bath with cold water from the barrels, not bothering to warm it. He felt far from worthy of a warm bath. The cold water bit at his skin as he lowered himself into the bath. The discomfort was welcome, for the chill distracted Izuku from the memory of Katsuki's warm hands. He scrubbed with a harsh brush viciously at every inch of his skin, even the many parts that had not been touched directly. He scrubbed his chest until his skin was red and raw, and he still did not feel clean. As per his wishes, Ochako did not come to dress Izuku in the morning. It was a welcome reprieve. It allowed him to take his time waking from his few hours of sleep, still exhausted. A glance in the looking glass revealed that his exhaustion was visible in the bags under his eyes and the downturn to his mouth. His dark green hair was a mess from not having been combed the previous night, and it took him a good amount of time to sort through it. Donning his undergarments, his dress, cloak, and veil was no subtle feat with only 2 hands, but Izuku managed it. He carefully chose the dress with the highest neckline, for the bruises from Katsuki's mouth littered not only his chest but also his neck. He took one last glance to make sure his soiled clothing from the previous night was hidden, his boots were out of sight, and the stone tiles of the flooring were not visibly soiled. He plastered a carefully neutral expression on the lower half of his face before exiting his chambers. Armor clinked as someone stood to attention. Izuku feigned surprise. "Oh, Tenya, what an unexpected pleasure to see you here." Izuku's guilt expanded upon his exaggerated words to the honorable knight. Tenya bowed slightly. "I apologize for the surprise. It must be most unwelcome after a hard night." Izuku did not answer, prompting the knight to continue. I mean, your servant disclosed that your sleep was plagued with nightmares." Izuku carefully hid his smirk at Oshacho's success. "Yes, she helped very much. She is wonderful." Tenya's blush was visible through the helm he always wore. Izuku kindly chose not to comment on it. "Shall we prepare to break your fast?" The Omega nodded despite the turmoil his stomach had been in for hours, following the knight to the writing room of the tower. Tenya peered carefully into the room before letting Izuku inside. He must have been instructed to do so by Yagi. Or Katsuki. Izuku shook the thought from his mind. The less he thought of Katsuki right now, the better. They received their breakfast from Tsuyu, the same servant who had brought Izuku his potions days ago. She was nice and considerate, addressing Izuku as an actual person, which earned his respect. After she left, however, Izuku barely picked at his food. The eggs and porridge were far from appetizing to him in the moment. Tenya didn't notice until he had finished his portion. "Did you want something else?" He looked around the empty room carefully before continuing. Izuku shook his head. "A lack of sleep results in a lack of appetite for me, unfortunately. I will eat as much as I am capable of." He upheld his words, though he was only capable of eating a few bites. Tenya refused to eat any of Izuku's portion, to his annoyance. They were in the midst of a light-hearted argument over the food when a knock sounded at the door. "Please, come in," Tenya called out. Izuku braced himself. Yagi stepped in, his hair yellow again. He must have washed it out thoroughly. He smiled at both of them, then turned to Tenya first. "Thank you, knight, for guarding his quarters last night," Yagi said. Tenya blushed slightly. "I only did as I was ordered to do, of course." "With honor." Yagi nodded, regarding the knight with a respectful gaze. "Your unexpected post is over now, Tenya. I will take over guarding the prize." The knight nodded at Yagi and tilted his head at Izuku, at the desk he sat at. "I will take these dishes and depart at once." And he did so, carrying the dishes laden with the food that Izuku did not eat. Yagi did not fail to notice. "No appetite?" the beta asked as soon as the writing room door had shut. Izuku shrugged, yawning. "It was a long night, as you know. It was difficult to sleep, and my exhaustion is still affecting me to this day." Yagi shifted, uncomfortable, and Izuku was quick to compensate. "It is of no fault of yours, I promise. Sleep has evaded me for most of my life." Yagi chose to avoid this statement and instead offered Izuku a rolled-up piece of parchment that he had hidden behind his back. "This may raise your spirits, my boy." "From Kota?" Izuku asked, perking up for the first time that day. Yagi nodded. "This arrived sooner than I expected. He must finally be taking some breaks from his studies. Becoming a silent one is a long and arduous process," the beta said. "He is lucky to be able to write you at all." Izuku acknowledged his words with a slight nod, though his lips were downturned. He had known that Kota would go to God's Citadel in his 10th year since his younger brother was born, but he had never truly prepared for how much he would miss him. The Silent Ones live only to serve God and his kingdom, keeping the histories and announcing God's will. They were said to be the only ones able to speak to God other than the royal Shigaraki line, but only after years of intense training and rigorous study to become worthy. No one, not even the royals outside of the Shigaraki family, knew what the training entailed. The Silent Ones, and the second children training to join them, were rarely ever seen by anyone, and even though they could write letters to their families, they were forbidden from discussing their studies. Whether the trainees were already devoted to their rules or whether their letters were simply being screened, Izuku did not know, but no talk of Kota's training occurred in their letters. Izuku felt a pain of loneliness as he unrolled the letter. Even though they had not spoken face to face in 6 years, Kota may have been someone Izuku could confide in about the whole thing with Katsuki. Izuku had no clue what to call it, even in his own thoughts. However, ever since Izuku had been punished without spoken reason just after writing something improper to Kota about wanting to train with the soldiers in the yard, he knew his letters were monitored. There was nowhere and no one Izuku could confide in. The weight of this dragged Izuku's mood even further down, even as he read Kota's warm words. His penmanship had come a long way over the years, but the idiosyncrasies in his words were familiar. The way he still refused to call All Might by his given name or surname when inquiring into his well-being, the way he sometimes referred to himself in the third person in jest. It usually brought a smile to Izuku's face, but today he simply could not move his lips further than a firm straight line. Only good news, I pray. Yagi's worried tone pulled Izuku's attention from the last lines of the letter, and he nodded. I had hoped word from Kota could be what helped you out of this cloud you seem to be under. Cloud? What do you mean? You know what I mean, Izuku, Yagi chided. Don't pretend you are daft. You acted strangely when we returned from the Scarlet Corner. I can't ever remember you being so eager to return to your tower, let last night you were. And now, today, not even your brother's words can lift the frown from your lips. He paused, then stepped closer to gently pat Izuku's shoulder. Did something happen? Izuku barely kept himself from curling his shoulders inward in embarrassment and defensiveness. He needed to play this off very carefully. It is just as I have already told you, Yagi. I am only still exhausted from the events of last night. His voice sounded genuine enough since he did not tell a lie. I do love hearing from Kota, but his letters also remind me how much I miss him. I wish I could see him. You know that is not allowed, Yagi scolded, but Izuku interrupted him before he could continue. I know that. I need not be reminded, he snapped, then mentally slapped himself. That outburst did not help his case at all. Yagi looked shocked. Izuku rarely ever spoke to him like that. Is it me? Did I do something yesterday to upset you? You left me in a room where I let my other guard do many intimate things to me without revealing who I was, Izuku thought, though he blamed only himself for that. Not at all. Please believe me, I am simply tired. It was a long night, and I did not sleep well afterward. His mentor looked conflicted but eventually chose to accept Izuku's excuse. Very well, I don't suppose you have the energy to train today. I wish I did, Izuku said, then pursed his lips. I am also nervous that someone may walk in on us here. Did the guard rotation schedule change? I was surprised to find Tenya outside of my door this morning. Instead of Katsuki, Izuku nodded, grateful for the veil hiding his pinkening cheeks. I don't know about a change in schedule, but Tenya took over because the Duke summoned Katsuki from what I've been informed of. That explained why Katsuki was at the Scarlet Corner. He must have been dragged along with Hisashi, but Izuku's worries were not yet soothed. What did the Duke summon him for? Neither seemed to enjoy each other's company, far from it. Did Katsuki finally rat Izuku out for speaking so freely when they were alone? It was quite fortunate that your father saw me at the Scarlet Corner. He had tried to summon me before Katsuki but no one could find me, and being at that place was a perfect excuse for my absence from the castle. Izuku exhaled, still nervous. He covered it by reaching for a piece of parchment to write a response to Kota. If Hisashi had tried to summon Yagi first, it was likely for something relating to Izuku. After being met with silence, Yagi attempted to soothe him. I should not tell you the subject of the summons, but I can assure you that you have nothing to worry about. He didn't believe him. If he summoned both of you, it must have something to do with me. Did he tell you what it was last night? Yagi crossed his arms as best as he could in his armor. Yes. Worry not, my boy, it relates to you only slightly. You should not be concerned. Izuku scoffed. If he shared the news with you in the middle of the Scarlet Corner, then countless others must have overheard. What does it matter if one more person knows? You are not just any person. You know that. Izuku couldn't hold back his reactive snark. You seem to be fond of telling me what I do or don't know and what I should or should not know today. Yagi sighed. You will be the reason my hair goes gray early, I swear it. That would be better than that horrendous black on you, he said, attempting to lighten the mood in apology. Fair enough, Yagi chuckled, then sighed at Izuku. Very well, there have been rumors of increasingly frequent instances of suspicious apostate activity, and the common people are seemingly growing disenchanted with the royals. Disenchanted? Izuku furrowed his brows. Are you saying that they are on the side of the apostates? Yagi waved his hand dismissively. No, I wouldn't say that. But the dissenters are learning how to cause chaos and suspicion without disclosing their true intentions or beliefs. This is all that I can tell you. Izuku frowned but resolved himself to leave it be. It would do neither of them to discuss the beliefs of the apostates. Not here, in this castle. Weeks passed by with little excitement in the castle. In Izuku's tower, especially. He could not ignore the increasingly disturbed looks in the eyes of certain soldiers he crossed paths with, nor the hushed whispers exchanged between peasants while they eyed the white form of the prize. Yagi was unable, or unwilling, perhaps, to tell Izuku anything more of the apostate activity that was doubtlessly the source of the unrest. There were no chances for Izuku to see how disorderly the town itself was. They received no summons from the common folk to deal with any curse-infected victims. None that Yagi told him of, anyway. Izuku felt as though the lack of outings was beginning to drive him mad, despite being used to being sequestered in his tower for the better part of the past decade. Most days were slightly cooler and overcast as summer bled into autumn, and the cloudy nights kept the moonflowers from blooming even when the moons were full. Izuku still walked the gardens, though with much less joy, on the nights he was able to, but only when Yagi was the one on watch. Izuku wished to keep his one-on-one time with Katsuki to an absolute minimum. Katsuki hadn't done anything to deserve that, of course. Not that he knew of. But that did not mitigate the turmoil of distressing emotions that Izuku felt in his presence. Izuku acted as normal as he could around the blonde, but walking the gardens together again, after everything, would be far too much. The moonflowers would not bloom, but the leaves. Your eyes are green, my favorite color. Izuku burned every time he remembered those sultry words. You're just perfect for me, aren't you? Izuku resisted the urge to cover his face with his hands in addition to his veil. He might have done so and played it off as a sore head was it Yagi watching him, but unfortunately, it was the other guard on duty today. His guard's behavior had not changed after that night. Katsuki's next shift went the same as all of his previous ones prior to the events of the Scarlet Corner. Full of teasing Izuku, trying to rile him up, all the while remaining as observant and careful as any decent guard should be. It both reassured Izuku and irked him that he could behave so regularly after speaking and enacting such sin. Katsuki had claimed he'd die if his companion, if Izuku, left that room. And Izuku had done just that, yet Katsuki showed up to his next shift as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't treated Izuku as if he was the most precious thing in the realm without knowing that he was the prize. Izuku discreetly rubbed his chest at the memory, even though the bruises were long gone. Katsuki stood diligently even now while Izuku sat with a book open, pacing from the door to the window and back again every so often. His sharp brown eyes squinted when he surveyed the town from the window, his gaze flitting about as if he could spot danger from so far away. Izuku did not want to find it amusing, but his lips still twitched each time. The sun has moved quite a distance across the sky, Katsuki remarked from the window, breaking their hours of silence. Izuku regarded him from beneath the veil. It tends to do that when time passes, yes. Katsuki shot him a half grin, causing Izuku's heart to skip a beat. And yet you have not turned a page in all that time. The Omega looked down at his book. It is a dense read. In truth, he had not read a single word on the page. Even weeks later, he had trouble keeping his mind off of the Scarlet Corner. Words blurred on the page whenever he attempted to read any book, much to the disdain of the priestess. I'm sure. The kingdom's history is a complicated one. The expression on Katsuki's face was one that Izuku struggled to identify. That it is, Izuku replied simply. Katsuki merely smirked and returned to the door. He always cut such an alluring figure in his leathers, devoid of bulky armor. Especially now that Izuku knew how his form looked in much more simple clothing and even without a shirt. He shook himself slightly, blaming it on the cool breeze from the window when Katsuki checked on him. Izuku wished he could wipe his memory clean of such filth. Izuku was summoned, to his surprise, to the Great Hall along with Yagi several days later. He had not stepped foot in the main castle in many weeks. The air felt heavier than last time, weighing his shoulders down into a slump. Rumors of apostate antics had only grown more frequent in recent days, and the resulting stress was palpable on the Duke's face when Izuku entered the hall. Several others were gathered around Hisashi as the prize and Yagi joined them. Among them were Tenya and a few other well-decorated knights, the Duke's advisor Garaki Kyudai, Commander Sorahiko Torino of the Castle Watch, and Commander Kayama Nimori of the City Watch. In the corner stood a curious figure, shrouded in dark attire made up of even more clothing than what Izuku wore. Katsuki had his armor on and stood unexpectedly close to Torino, a rare but fierce Omega soldier who whispered into the tall beta's lowered ear. Katsuki's eyes were contemplative, locked onto Izuku's approaching form. "Welcome, son," and Yagi, the Duke said, his eyes clear and sober for once. He nodded at Yagi and gestured for Izuku to stand next to him. The Omega acquiesced, taking note of all the individuals around him as he did. He was unfamiliar with the knights next to Tenya, but their capes bore impressive embroidery that identified them as high-ranking soldiers. Garaki Kyudai was no stranger to Izuku. Indeed, he had caught him as a babe during his birth. He had since left the study of medicine to serve at the Duke's right-hand side. His gaze behind his seeing glasses was clever and manipulative. Commander Torino had served on the Castle Watch for most of his life and held the title of commander for decades. His rule was strong but fair as he dealt with any threats from both outside of and within the castle. Commander Nimori was the head of the city of Mongoria's defense, a formidable woman who would never accept failure. She was famous for using her whip alongside her sword, an unusual combination that allowed her to dominate the battlefield. Izuku knew that he stood among alphas aside from his father. Nimori and Kyudai were supposedly alphas, though he could not smell them. They must have been ordered to take suppressant potions. Once Izuku reached his father's side, the Duke exhaled. There was no alcohol on his breath for once. "We shall begin the crux of the meeting at once. Commander Nimori, your report." Kayama strode to the center of the circle of individuals, her infamous whip in hand. Unrest spreads throughout the town. The common folk have no reachable authority to turn to, so they are susceptible to persuasion. She pursed her lips. "They must be tamed as soon as possible, Your Grace." Hisashi nodded, his face grim. "Torino, any concerns about the castle's safety?" Torino straightened from where he stood next to Katsuki. "There are no concerns, but that is no excuse to be lax in our security. I suggest regular patrols of the border of the castle grounds and a special watch to keep an eye on the Crimson Woods. The mist grows more dense every night." "I concur," proclaimed Tenya. "I have soldiers in my legion to spare for this, and I am sure the others do too." The other knights nodded in agreement. "This is inappropriate," Kyudai hissed, glancing at the prize. "Why is he here? He knows not of the issues of the realm. He has no say in them, nor will he ever." Izuku tensed, but Yagi defended him. "He is the most precious person in this castle, is he not? And the most beloved by the common folk in the past." The Duke nodded. "He is a pure and delicate thing, an Omega chosen by God." Izuku did not miss Katsuki's exasperated expression. Garaki has offered a most promising suggestion to lift the public spirits. I will speak to the town from the royal stage with the prize present. Izuku inhaled sharply. The royal stage was primarily used for public executions or to read out important decrees from the king. Using it to address issues in the town was unprecedented. Having Izuku present was unspeakable. The last time he had been presented to the public outside of the castle was at the tournament, and that had been a unique occurrence. As that wise, Katsuki finally spoke up. Kyudai looked outraged at his insolence. There is no barrier between the stage and the crowd. Someone could try to go after the prize. Chirino coughed. Or the Duke. Izuku stared at Katsuki. That was the first time he had ever called him the prize, and he did so with an unpleasant grimace on his face. No citizen would have such insolence to attempt that, Kyudai insisted. They would be fools to do so. The city is not lacking in fools, Nimari remarked, a wry smile on her face. One would simply need to visit the Scarlet Corner to find that out. Several chuckles broke the tension of the room, but the Duke tensed. Do not mention such a place in front of my son. He placed his hands on Izuku's shoulders protectively. Nimari held her free hand up in apology. The public rarely hears from any royalty directly, said Kyudai. Doing so now will quell their fears and, hopefully, suppress any apostates in the crowd. Yagi did not look convinced. Still, Katsuki has a point. There must be adequate protection for both members of the royalty. Hisashi brushed him off with a wave of his hand, the other remaining on Izuku. Both guards of the prize will be present, along with many of my own guards and several knights as well. Commander Nimari will keep watch over the crowd and Commander Torino will ensure the castle is protected in my absence. Yagi sighed, seeming to accept that the Duke's mind would not be changed. Very well, Your Grace. When will this occur? Katsuki asked. In 2 days, Kyudai answered. It is of utmost importance, but the Duke requires time to prepare his speech, even with help. He glanced quickly at the hooded figure. A silent one, Izuku realized. How long had they been in the castle? Has the king approved of this action? Torino's question went unanswered for some time. It will take too long to send a bird and receive an answer, the Duke finally said, though he looked uneasy. His Grace will surely understand, though. He is familiar with the effect the apostates can have on the kingdom's citizens. Izuku thought of the eldest Todoroki's son, who was said by Shoto to be investigating the source of the rebellious activity. Son, Hisashi addressed him, turning Izuku to face him with the hand still on his shoulder. Do you understand why you must be present? You are a symbol not just for the royalty but for the common people as well. You were handpicked by God from the moment you were born. You will likely be the newest addition to the Shigaraki line, the first to marry into the king's family in decades. You are proof that the apostates are nothing more than heretics who spread false hearsay to discredit the crown. Izuku nodded slowly but definitively, unwilling to use his voice in front of so many people. His father nodded back with a quick jerk of his head, then turned to Nimari. Make sure that your city watch stays vigilant in the next few days, Commander, he told her. Spread word of the upcoming announcement to the most important people of the town. She nodded, a determined look in her eyes. It will be done, Your Grace. Very well, then. The Duke clapped his hands together. Let us begin planning. Son, you may return to your tower. Everyone else should remain here. He pointed at one of the knights, who stood up straight under the attention. You, go fetch a servant to bring us wine and food. This need not be such a serious affair. The knight dashed off to the door. Izuku, Yagi, and Katsuki bowed their heads towards the Duke, Katsuki's much less enthusiastic than the rest, before departing the great hall. They walked back to Izuku's tower in silence, Katsuki in the front while Yagi remained beside Izuku. He could tell that both of his guards had something to say based on the furrow in Katsuki's brow and the firm line of Yagi's tense lips, but they each held their tongues for now. Katsuki nodded to the soldiers standing outside the tower's entrance, then stepped inside, surveying the hall before letting Izuku through. Izuku headed for the room at the first landing of the stairs, but Yagi stopped him. Wait, my boy, he called out. Izuku looked at him curiously. Go further up. The higher, the better. Katsuki grunted in agreement. Izuku obeyed and climbed the steps to the highest room other than his chambers. He stepped aside to let Yagi inspect the room before allowing the others entry. It was a room not often used, especially in the summer. Even now during the beginning of autumn, Izuku had not been in here since last winter. It housed a few chairs that faced an unlit fireplace. Yagi took a seat first, sighing as he settled into the chair. He looked drained, and a quick inquiry with his gift told Izuku that his old injury was bothering him as well. Izuku was worried, but he didn't address it in front of Katsuki. He merely sat in the chair next to his mentor, folding his gloved hands neatly in his lap. Katsuki pulled off his armor one piece at a time, resting the pieces on the floor, revealing his leathers underneath. Yagi frowned at him but didn't otherwise remark on it. So, Katsuki started, leaning his shoulder against the wall. Am I the only one who sees how foolish this plan is? Yagi shook his head, looking troubled. No, I agree. It is not unexpected for the Duke to have thought up such a thing, but Garaki should know better. Izuku fiddled with his hands. He's supposed to be the voice of reason in my father's ear. Something feels off. Of course, something is off, Katsuki barked. Yagi clicked his tongue in disapproval at his tone, so Katsuki continued more gently after he jerked his chin at Izuku. They planned to parade him in front of a tumultuous crowd like a prize, Izuku muttered dejectedly. Yagi sighed next to him. The crowd will not see you as the prize, though. Katsuki nodded. They'll see him as a pampered royal who lives in luxury while they're lucky if their children get one meal a day. Izuku looked at him, surprised and alarmed. There's a shortage of food. He turned to Yagi. You did not tell me this. I did not want to worry you, Yagi replied sheepishly. There is nothing either of us can do about it. I had no idea. The castle still serves full meals to everyone. The humble duke prioritizes the well-being of the castle and its inhabitants, Katsuki drawled. If he ignores a problem, he doesn't have to address it. No wonder the public's opinion is so susceptible to being swayed by the apostates now, Izuku realized. Why is this not being addressed at all? The farmlands are dying, Katsuki explained, causing Izuku's eyes to widen beneath his veil. There is nothing that can be done at this point. Why are they dying? Izuku asked, confused. We have had plenty of rain this year, have we not? Yagi chimed in again. The kingdom's irrigation techniques are far from sufficient. Evidently, this has finally caught up with us. Food has been scarce since early this summer, and the herds of large animals have moved to other lands. Only rodents and sheep remain. That was why the Duke made your appointment as my guard a public affair, Izuku realized, looking at Katsuki. The tournament was a distraction from the inevitable famine. And this only helps the apostate's cause. Katsuki scratched the back of his neck. The fallen kingdom was said to have had plentiful harvests year after year, even during droughts. Izuku furrowed his brows. What does the fallen kingdom have to do with the apostates? Katsuki looked between him and Yagi in shock. What the hell do you think the apostates are rioting for? Have you told him nothing, Yagi? The Omega frowned at his mentor. I thought they are just heretics who reject Umbrengrad's monotheistic god. They disapprove of the Shigaraki's rule because they worship the old gods. The fallen kingdom was supposedly ruled under the approval of the old gods, Yagi admitted. Realization bloomed in Izuku's chest. They want to reinstate the old kingdom of Draconia. But there are none of those citizens left. Even the Cursed One has been long dead. Katsuki sneered. If he's dead, why does the curse still exist? Why do the cursed ghouls still walk the Crimson Woods, multiplying every day? Yagi shook his head. The history books never said that the curse would disappear when the cursed prince died. History books that Umbrengrad wrote, Katsuki pointed out. It has been hundreds of years since the kingdom was formed. Certain facts have surely been lost to time. Izuku's thoughts raced at all the revelations. If the prince is still alive, then he has been living for the past 200 years. I thought only the Shigaraki line was gifted with immortality. Katsuki shrugged. He's been directing the apostates this whole time. Why choose now to ramp up the activity? Only the apostates know the answer to that, my boy, Yagi sighed. And we have never been able to catch one alive. Katsuki grimaced. They kill themselves before they can be questioned, don't they? Yagi nodded. How? Surely they are immediately cuffed and gagged. Yagi shrugged. We truly have no idea how they do it. It is like they can induce an immediate, fatal heart attack by will. Or by the grace of their gods, Katsuki scoffed sarcastically. Both Yagi and Izuku shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Either way, we can presume the apostates will attempt some sort of stunt at the gathering, Yagi predicted. Especially once they find out the prize will be there. To normal citizens, you are a reminder of how the kingdom and the duke are failing them. To the apostates. Katsuki finished for him, his gaze burning Izuku through the veil. You are a target. The royal stage had been erected decades ago and stood between the town and the castle in an open clearing. It was not as huge as the arena just outside the city walls but was still large enough to contain a good number of Mongoria's population. Today, though, it was more crowded than ever. Summons had only been sent to lords and business owners, but word of mouth was widespread enough that all kinds of citizens had gathered. They stood shoulder to shoulder, sweating under the sun that shone unprecedentedly hot for an autumn day. Izuku clasped his hands together behind his back to keep from fidgeting from nerves as he approached the stage. Yagi and Katsuki walked side by side behind him, and his father walked in front of him with his own guards. Commander Nimori already stood on the stage, her jet-black hair shining almost blue in the harsh sunlight. The Duke had ordered all of the soldiers that were to stand on the stage to be devoid of their armor so they would be less threatening to the crowd, a decision with which both of Izuku's guards disagreed heavily. Yagi had barely convinced Hisashi to let them be armed. Izuku was armed as well, to Yagi's approval. He had been allowed to skip his cloak since he would be standing in direct sunlight for the entire length of the speech and would otherwise risk overheating. This made the dagger at his thigh easily accessible through the hole in his skirts should he need it. He expected that he may very well need it, as did his guards. Yagi's hand never left the pommel of his sword even as they walked downhill from the castle, and Katsuki's head swiveled in Izuku's periphery, already surveying for threats. The noise of the crowd grew louder as they arrived at the stage. Many of them were blatantly pointing at Izuku as they realized the rumors of the presence of the prize were true. Nimori's hand clenched tighter around her whip as if resisting the urge to crack it to quiet them down. Izuku was already sweating, both from the heat of the sun and from his nerves. He could protect himself and he had two very capable guards, but the crowd already seemed on edge. Among them were doubtlessly several apostates. Calm yourself, my boy, Yagi whispered as they took their place on the left side of the stage, though he too appeared uneasy. The audience must not be allowed to sense anything but confidence and comfort from you. Izuku nodded, taking a deep breath and squaring his shoulders. Katsuki stood to his left, his eyes calculating and perceptive as they swept through the crowd. They took a break now and again to look at Izuku from top to bottom. It was the first time Katsuki had seen him as the prize without a cloak over his gown. His dress was an ostentatious one. Hisashi had ordered him to wear it when he presented it to Izuku the previous day. Izuku and Ochako had rushed to add the hole in the right side to make his weapon accessible through the layers of the skirts. The dress was only slightly cinched at the waist, not nearly tight enough to show Izuku's true size. Below the cinch were the silk skirts and above it was a lacy yet still opaque white bodice. The intricate designs of the lace continued up the collar on his neck and down the long sleeves on his arms, all the way down to where his wrists were covered by his long gloves. These gloves too were lacy, which should allow Izuku to still have a good grip on his dagger if he needed to wield it. He wore his veil as always, though Ochako had added extra chains to secure it firmly in place in case the wind picked up. It would be quite a scandal if his face was revealed to the entire town. Dozens of the Duke's guards took their place in a horizontal line spreading from either side of the stage to form a wall, which stood a few feet above the ground. The others stood behind the Duke, who had made his way to the front and center of the stage. A rolled-up piece of parchment was tucked into the back of his breeches, out of the audience's sight. He never reached for it, though, having evidently memorized the speech. He wore a billowing purple shirt that was designed to shimmer under the sunlight, drawing all attention to him. Hisashi cleared his throat slightly before raising his arms in greeting. "Welcome, good people of Mongoria. You have my humble gratitude for gathering here today. The crowd finally began to quiet as he spoke, though some whispers never stopped. No one smiled at the words of their duke. I am sure that you all know that the one true God watches over this city, as he does over every city in the kingdom of Umbrangrad. His gracious hand has blessed every legitimate citizen of the realm. His tone hardened. That does not include the traitorous apostates. They act against the king and even against God himself with their words and actions. They can never be trusted. The audience stirred as the people muttered to each other. None of them looked approving yet. Izuku shifted uncomfortably. Yagi shot him a look and tried to smile comfortingly, but it did not look genuine. The crown acknowledges that hard times have fallen upon the kingdom, but rest assured that we are doing everything in our power to relieve the burdens placed on the common folk. Katsuki scoffed lightly at the lie and Izuku bit back a smile at the quiet sound. My good people, you must harden your resolve. You must remain devoted to your kingdom's royalty and trust that we have your best interests in our hearts. All of the lords, dukes, and the king care deeply for all of our loyal citizens. The apostates, however, do not. The crowd shifted at the mention of the dissenters. Izuku felt his gift pulsing and cursed inwardly, willing it to remain buried. It was difficult to control in a large gathering such as this. The last time he had been around so many people had been at the tournament, where he had been unable to prevent his gift from flooding his body with the pain of the dying competitors, and all he could do was grimace. Now, however, no one should be in pain, aside from maybe Yagi due to his injury. Perhaps, though, some had been standing here long enough to be beginning to suffer from heat exhaustion. But the tugs from his gift felt different this time. When Izuku's control over it grew lax, it was not a sharp pain that he felt but rather a dull ache. It did not feel like pain at all, really, but it still made his insides feel hotter. No, the Duke continued, the apostates do not act for the betterment of the kingdom and its people. They intend to drag us down, to break us apart from the inside. We must all be resilient to their attempts no matter what stunts they attempt to pull. Remember that they are delusional heretics who worship non-existent gods, which is the utmost sin. An extra strong pulse from his gift caused Izuku to sway, alarming both of his guards. He did not look at them, though. His focus was caught by the person his gift felt tethered to. It was a brown-haired woman who stood towards the center of the crowd. She looked furious, her brow deeply furrowed and her teeth gnashing beneath her frown. The skin of her face was flushed, though it didn't seem to be from the sun. Izuku lost control, and his gift took over. It flooded into him and he barely stood strong against the urge to sway again. His heart thudded in his chest, his blood roared through his veins, his brain pounded between his ears. It was not pain he felt, but anger. Pure, unbridled rage that stirred up his guts and lit his limbs on fire. His eyes widened as he saw the woman begin to mutter under her breath, her tense lips barely moving, while her furious eyes remained locked on Hisashi. As many of you know, they walk hidden among us. They spread lies and hearsay, and you must watch out for them. Watch out for your neighbor who does not pray often enough. Watch out for your friend who shares with you his distrust of the crown. Watch out for the educator who tells subtle but poisonous lies to your children. Members of the crowd were being lured by the Duke's words, looking at each other in suspicion. His father's words began to blur together in Izuku's ears, however. The woman was looking at Izuku now, their eyes locked as if she could see right through the veil. She began to move then, flicking her stare back to Hisashi as she pushed forward through the throng of people. The crowd was dense but she was very slim, her bones visible through the skin on her arms. Izuku shifted, feeling conflicted. His mouth was visible and he was forbidden from being seen speaking in front of the common folk, but he felt he had to warn his guards. His worry ended up being unneeded. Brown-haired woman, towards the middle of the mass, Yagi muttered. Katsuki nodded, his gaze already locked on her. I've been watching her for a while. There's also the dark-haired man on the right side, closer to the stage. Izuku spotted him right away. He wore a similar expression of rage on his face, though his dark skin showed no flush, and he was also making his way forward to the stage. The Duke's guards haven't noticed, Yagi said as he watched them. They need to be informed. He moved to do just that but was interrupted by a loud voice from the crowd. What about the second sons and daughters? It was the brown-haired woman. Her words were spoken with blatant rage. Who watches out for them? Do they starve as we do here? Hisashi looks taken aback. They are cared for by the silent ones at the citadel, of course. The woman clasps a hand over her chest, displeased. There is no proof of that. What do you really do with the children you steal away from us? Where really is my daughter? She began to ache with pain as she thought of her child. Izuku felt it in his chest, and he momentarily felt pity for her. Then the crowd grew restless and the pity faded. Settle down, Hisashi called out pleadingly. You all receive letters regularly from your second children, do you know? Murmurs of agreement spread throughout the audience. Izuku nodded, thinking of Kota's distinct handwriting. Lies. It was the dark-haired man who yelled now. Several heads scattered throughout the gathering nodded their approval of his declaration, Katsuki's sharp eyes tracking each of them. They are forged. What god's forsaken reason do you take them for? The crowd rippled as several more dissenters began to push their way to the front, to the stage. Guards, stop them. Hisashi called and gestured for the guards to push them back, but it was too late. Several reached the stage in the next few heartbeats, including the dark-haired man. He reached into his pockets and pulled something out. He wrenched his arm back to throw it on the stage, right at Hisashi. The Duke ducked as it sailed just over his head, missing him by a few fingers' width. The object bounced a few times before settling towards the back of the stage. Izuku peered at it, identifying it as some piece of flesh. It was slightly pink and cylindrical, but he could not get a good look at it before Yagi blocked his view. That's what we think of your precious guards, the man cried out. He and several others were grabbing at the stage now, too many of them for the guards on the ground to suppress. Beeping pricks. Don't look, Yagi told Izuku, who was still trying to see the body part. What is it? Izuku asked, worried. It belonged to a guard, didn't it? It is inappropriate. We need to. His words were drowned out by another outburst, this time from the brown-haired lady who was now on the stage as well. From Fire and Ash, a guard tried to grab her, but he missed. From Fire and Ash, we will rise. Izuku gasped at her words. The call was that of the Cursed One, forbidden to be spoken. She pointed right at Izuku. And he will fall, bringing this damned farce of a kingdom down with him. She was an apostate, as was the black-haired man. All of the people trying to climb onto the stage were. And they were going after Izuku. Get him out of here. Yagi yelled, drawing his sword. The other soldiers drew their weapons as well. Nimari cracked her whip at the crowd, which had begun to turn into a riot at the brown-haired woman's sacrilegious words. Katsuki was already on the move, unsheathing his own sword and shoving Izuku towards the back of the stage. Izuku's shoes were unsuited for rushing, however, and they caught on the stage's uneven wood. His arms flailed as he began to trip over. He gasped as an arm caught him around the middle, and his feet left the stage entirely as he was hoisted up and over a strong shoulder, stomach down. Katsuki carried him easily, one arm around Izuku's back and the other brandishing his sword at rioters who had managed to get past the line of soldiers. He ran quickly, followed by the Duke and his guards. Izuku looked up from where he was draped over Katsuki's shoulder, his head facing toward the crowd. Yagi and the other soldiers fought them off valiantly, but there were just too many riled-up common folk that he was being overpowered and forced backward. One of the soldiers who had been on the stage and was without armor was the first to fall to the dissenters who made it onto the stage, and they descended upon his fallen body. The air filled with the heart-wrenching sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking. The dark-haired apostate stood from the frenzy, brandishing something bloody over his head. Meat. We have meat. It was an arm. Izuku's vision blurred during the rest of the run back to the castle. He was grateful that Katsuki was willing to carry him the whole way back because he wasn't sure if he would have been able to keep his balance. Or his breakfast. The mob had been enraged and hungry enough to literally tear a man limb from limb. Izuku was no stranger to gore. His memory was tainted with it every time he looked at his scars, but this was a new level of depraved. Izuku did not realize they had made it back into the castle until he was being set down on his feet. He looked around dazed, to discover that they were just inside the entryway to his tower. "Are you all right?" Katsuki asked, peering at him intently as if he could see any part of Izuku other than his lips and jaw. His hands still rested softly on Izuku's waist where he had held him to carry him. Izuku gazed back at him, unfocused. "What?" He glanced around. "Deku." His guard snapped. "Look at me, Katsuki." "Yes, it's me." His voice was softer than Izuku had ever heard since the Scarlet Corner. Izuku lifted a trembling hand to his heart. "That soldier, his arm." Katsuki swore. "I was hoping you hadn't seen that. I'm sorry, I should have gotten you out of there much sooner." "S'alright," Izuku slurred, then straightened his back. "You carried me out of there. If you hadn't been there, Yagi isn't strong enough to lift me anymore." "He's much skinnier than I expected he would be," Katsuki agreed. Izuku realized that had been the first time he'd seen Yagi without his armor. Izuku looked down at Katsuki's hands. "You're still touching me. You're not supposed to touch me. I had to touch you to get you out of there, didn't I?" Katsuki stared at where he was still touching Izuku's waist. "Since your dumb ass can't seem to walk right." "My shoes," Izuku whined, causing the beta to grin. "Are you going to let go of me? Do you truly want me to?" Katsuki teased, nearly causing Izuku to smack him. "Yes, fine." Katsuki reluctantly released him but kept his eyes on Izuku's abdomen. His lips were slightly parted, and Izuku watched as his tongue flitted out to lick over them. "Katsuki," Izuku said again. Katsuki only hummed. "You're staring." "I know. It's making me uncomfortable." "Is it?" His gaze traveled slowly upward until it landed on Izuku's face. He was still smirking down at him. "Yes," Izuku whispered, his skin feeling hot. "Very much so. That sounds like your problem, not mine." Izuku frowned at the tease, and Katsuki laughed. His smile faded as he took in Izuku's appearance, gazing at his head. His back curled as he began to bend over, taking a few steps forward as he did so. Izuku's eyes widened at his close proximity. Katsuki's lashes were darker than his hair, stark against the skin of his half-closed eyelids. His still parted lips were getting closer and closer to Izuku's. Izuku gasped as clarity kicked in. He raised one shaking hand between them and clasped it over his mouth to block the kiss, keeping his eyes closed. He would never forgive himself otherwise. He felt something tug at his veil and began to panic. Was Katsuki trying to take it off? "There," Katsuki declared, his voice further than expected. Izuku opened his eyes to see that he had stepped back a couple of feet. Damn thing was crooked. Izuku reached up with his free hand to touch the veil. Oh, gods. Katsuki had just been fixing his crooked veil. Izuku had completely misunderstood his intentions. Izuku's mind raced, trying to come up with some excuse as Katsuki looked at his hand in confusion. "Why are you covering your mouth?" "Oh gods." Izuku's brain was coming up blank, and he cursed it as he lowered his hands. He prayed Katsuki wouldn't figure it out. "Oh my god," Katsuki said incredulously. "Seriously, you thought I was going to kiss you?" He laughed cruelly. "You, with your ugly lips." Izuku dropped his gaze to the floor shamefully. "No, you misunderstand." "I don't think I do." Katsuki crossed his arms and sneered. "You're delusional. Why the hell would I try to kiss you? Ridiculous." The Omega's brain chose that moment to start working again. "You're wrong. I got a wave of nausea. I thought I was going to be sick." "Really?" Katsuki did not sound like he believed him. "Are you sure about that?" Izuku nodded, still not looking up from the floor. His chest ached. "I think you lie, Deku." His tone was cruel and vicious. "You're pathetic sometimes, do you know that? You may be the prize, but your sense of self is extremely overinflated. Do you think every soul in this kingdom is falling over themselves to have you?" "No," Izuku protested weakly. "Please, stop. You are a vain, pretentious creature. It makes me wish I never entered that damn tournament." The words cut right through Izuku's heart, into his soul. "A kiss, beeping hell. Get this through your thick damn skull. I would never desire to kiss you. The king himself could order me to do it and I would refuse. I'd lose my head before I would even consider it." "Enough," Izuku yelled, panting. I get it. Katsuki only looked at him coolly. You've made yourself loud and clear on the subject. Thank you for today, by the way, but I want to go to my rooms now. Katsuki scoffed. It is barely past midday. You haven't even eaten lunch. I'm not hungry. Izuku willed the tears away from his eyes. Don't be foolish. I'm not. The Omega exclaimed. I'm going to my chambers so I don't have to look at your disgusting face anymore. It's no wonder I nearly got sick in your presence. Katsuki rolled his eyes. Sure, whatever you say. He bent in a mocking bow. Don't panic, Prize. I'm not trying to kiss you, I'm only bowing to his grace. Izuku stomped off to the stairs while Katsuki laughed meanly behind him. He ascended them quickly and did not hesitate to slam the door behind him in his guard's face. He panted in the silent air of his chambers. He ripped his veil off, not caring of how the clasps for the chains tore from the fabric and clattered to the floor. The water of the wash basin was welcomingly cool when he splashed it on his face. His skin was red when he looked at his reflection in the looking glass. The sight of his own distraught face sent tears flowing from Izuku's eyes. His ugly lips trembled, bitten bloody by his teeth as he tried to bite back his sobs. Stupid, he whispered to himself. This was only confirmation that Katsuki would have never done all those things in the Scarlet Corner had he known it was Izuku. It was not a surprising revelation, but it still hurt. The following days were dreary. The castle lay under a heavy crowd of misery in the aftermath of the riot. Backup soldiers had managed to quell the mob, but the mood of the town remained in a quiet rage. Imports from the capital briefly alleviated the food shortage, but the common folk were still disgruntled. Izuku had been forbidden to leave his tower for any reason other than his father's summons. He was not allowed to walk the gardens, even while guarded. There was talk of erecting an additional gated wall between the castle and the town, but there were not enough resources to support such a project. Not during a famine. His guards were more diligent than ever. Katsuki never stopped pacing, though he never spared Izuku a single glance even when he was snapping at him. Yagi no longer sat during his shift, remaining on his feet even when he panted. Holding off the riot had done irreversible damage to his stamina. Izuku caught him sneaking a sip from a potion one morning while he studied with Priestess Shiozaki. The flask was hidden in the back of Yagi's belt. His hand trembled as he subtly brought it to his lips, sipping from the flask delicately. Izuku frowned. Yagi tended to avoid potions whenever possible, never trusting of the side effects. Izuku kept a careful eye on him. Shiozaki smacked the book in his hands with her pointer stick, startling him. Focus, Prize. Now more than ever you must carefully study the decrees of God. He is the one who watches over us during this time of turmoil. Izuku nodded, grateful for the veil disguising his eye roll. Of course, Priestess. Shall I read aloud? Very well, she sniffed. The first Shigaraki was blessed by God himself. Face to face, Izuku read. God saw his morality, his just nature, and ruled that he must be the one to rule the first kingdom of God. His gracious hand gave the newly anointed Shigaraki his utmost favor. The king and his son became immortal, healing inhumanly quickly from injuries and rejecting any illness with ease. Yagi's armor clinked as he walked to the window of the reading room, gazing out of it inquisitively. Izuku did not miss how he favored his left side. The Omega reached out with his gift, sensing the pain that his mentor felt from his old injury, and gently drained some of that pain. Yagi's shoulders visibly relaxed. Continue, Shiozaki ordered. It was by the grace of God that the blasphemous kingdom of Draconia was eliminated, Izuku said. It had been a long time coming that the realm of the false gods fell. The last living Draconian was the heartless prince, who was thought to be impossible to kill. It was only after God cursed the fire-born prince that he was able to be killed by the first King Shigaraki. Afterward, the false kingdom of Draconia fell. Very good, Shiozaki nodded in approval. Izuku barely held back a scoff but was unable to hold back his grievances. Yet somehow, the cursed remain even though the cursed prince should be dead. What was that? The priestess demanded. I can only hope you do not doubt the histories of God's kingdom. Of course not, Izuku lied. He felt Yagi's gaze on him through the veil. You must have misheard me. You are such an insolent thing. Her voice was shocked and disappointed at the same time. Your father will hear of this, and he will punish you accordingly. His father knows better, Yagi interrupted, thumbing at the pommel of his sword. Shiozaki huffed. You were both so disrespectful to the one true religion. God himself frowns upon you. You will regret this. With that, she stormed from the reading room, slamming the door behind her. How pleasant, Yagi remarked, and Izuku chuckled. I cannot be blamed for doubting her, Izuku said. That apostate's words have been the subject of the castle's gossip time and time again. From fire and ash, he said. There would be no reason to say that unless the cursed one still lives. Yagi nodded. It seems Katsuki was correct. Izuku's heart dropped at his other guard's name. The priestess was far too defensive. She knows more than she lets on. Izuku hummed in agreement. She is one of the few from the citadel who exists in the public eye and who is allowed to speak. She is certainly directed by the king's will. His mentor sighed. The kingdom's god is a controlling one. He would be, if he existed, Izuku retorted. Yagi clucked his tongue. Watch your words, my boy. Katsuki could enter this room at any time. Izuku rolled his eyes. Katsuki is busy with my father these days. Evidently he is more devoted to my father than he is to me, which is rather unexpected. I wouldn't say that, Yagi countered. He counters the Duke more often than not. I suppose. He is still a jerk, though. Yagi chuckled, then put a stoic expression on his face. You have only spoken criticisms of your other guards since the riot. Did something happen, Izuku? Izuku painted his face neutral. No, of course not. I suppose I was simply embarrassed that he had to carry me out of there and that I could not help you. You were only armed with a dagger, Yagi reasoned. That weapon is little use against such a large mob. I held my own, my boy. You need not linger on it. I understand, Izuku answered, facing the floor. He perked up suddenly. Have the gods spoken to you? Yagi shook his head. I have not heard from them in a long time. Izuku frowned. This is not necessarily a bad signal, though. Merely a sign that they feel no need to intervene in our actions. It is hard to believe that we worship the same gods as the apostates, Izuku remarked. Even though we have much different intentions than them. The gods have plans outside of our understanding, said Yagi. They can play many sides for their desired outcome. We should not question them. I do question them sometimes, Izuku admitted. They seem rash and even illogical sometimes. They can condemn me all they want, but it is the truth. Yagi sighed. They know more than you ever will. The morals of their actions and their decrees can never be understood by us humans. Even Baylor, Izuku asked. The god of Omegas, of purity and chastity, was said to be the most demure god. He never spoke any decree, never condemned any soul. That we know of, Yagi pointed out. Izuku scoffed. The god of Omegas is a misunderstood one, I believe. The Draconians believed him to be the strongest of the gods, contrary to current thought. The Draconians are dead, Izuku said definitively. Omegas are the inferior gender, now. I have no rights in this realm. An unfortunate truth, Yagi said simply. Though you would make a great ruler, Izuku. The Omega blushed bright red. I highly doubt that. A single knock sounded on the door to the room. Izuku looked out the window, seeing that the sun was just past midday, and groaned. The knocker waited for Yagi's answer before entering. It was the servant Tsuyu. Her wide eyes were bigger than usual, a tinge of guilt in their irises. I hope I do not disturb the prize. Not at all, Yagi answered. What brings you here, servant? Tsuyu hesitated, fiddling with her long-fingered hands. The Duke calls for him, and him alone. She shot a sympathetic glance to Izuku, which he returned with a slight smile on his exposed lips. For what reason? Yagi questioned. Tsuyu's expression grew sheepish. I cannot tell you, Esser. The Duke did not disclose this information. Izuku felt faint. His Grace instructed me to guide him to his Grace's chambers, Tsuyu continued. Only the prize is to enter, though. Yagi nodded, a distraught expression on his face. Very well. Thank you, servant. Izuku looked at him, his stress palpable even with only his mouth exposed. When Yagi hesitated to move, the Omega said, It's all right, we can go now. Are you sure? My boy. I am. Suyu looked between them with a worried expression, yet still led them down the stairs of the tower. The Duke's back faced Izuku when he entered his chambers alone. The room was arranged as it always had been. A large bed, a crackling fireplace, several couches, and a scarcely used desk. It was 3 times the size of Izuku's bedroom. Hisashi sat on one of the couches, the fingers of one hand tapping the arm impatiently while the fingers of the other were wrapped around a cup that was undoubtedly filled with wine or some other alcohol. The cabinet in the corner was the only thing that consistently changed in the room, constantly drained and restocked with new bottles. He did not immediately react when Izuku entered. His shoulders were tense, just as much as his unseen expression must have been. Izuku felt a shiver run down his spine. "Why are you here?" Hisashi finally said, his voice neutral but still tinged with anger. Izuku gulped. "You summoned me, father. Don't act smart with me." He slapped his hand on the arm of the couch, causing his son to jump. "Why are you here, Izuku?" The Omega hung his head. "I am to be punished." His father finally stood and turned, liquid spilling from his cup at the movement. "For what reason?" Izuku remembered Shiozaki's threats. "She must have gone straight to the Duke. I have been impertinent to a priestess. You have been impertinent to God." Hisashi slammed his cup down on a nearby table before striding over to his son. "The God who blessed you from the moment you were born." He lifted Izuku's veil and threw it to the side. "The God who protected you from those cursed creatures." His finger roughly jabbed at the scars across Izuku's left eye. Izuku could only tremble. "I am sorry, father. The king claimed you to marry into his line over a decade ago," Hisashi continued, ignoring him. "My grandchildren will be in line for the throne itself. Or rather, they would be, if you stopped acting like a damn apostate." He was truly furious. Izuku's father rarely ever cursed in front of him. "I have no empathy for the heretics. And yet you spew words that could have come from them." Hisashi's chest heaved, spit spewing from his mouth as he yelled. "They tried to go after you. They would have torn you apart just as they did that poor guard." Izuku blinked back tears at the memory. "I know." His father sighed, then took a deep breath. "Why would you say such a thing? To a priestess, of all people." Izuku fiddled with his hands. "I have not felt like myself recently. Not since the riot. I understand. I truly do, son. But you must still be punished." He moved to undo the clasp of Izuku's cloak. The Omega nodded, his heart beating rapidly. His skin tensed in anticipation of what was to come. Hisashi removed his cloak, then moved on to the fastenings of his dress. It was a simple one, held in place by a column of buttons and a few ribbons that were deftly undone. Izuku's arms raised to hold the front of the gown in place while the back fell away, exposing his skin. The Duke thumbed at a large set of scars visible at his side. "Such a shame." He had said these same words many times, especially when looking at Izuku's marred face, but they never called to make his heart drop. Izuku was guided to kneel on one of the couches, his knees sinking into the soft cushions. He grasped the back of the couch with one hand, the other remaining over his chest. In the meantime, Hisashi walked to a nearby desk, where his cane undoubtedly rested. Izuku did not look at it now, keeping his eyes on the stone floors, but he could picture it in his mind. Other than the steel handle, it was red all over, matching his alpha father's eyes. The blood metal was interlaced with the red wood cut from the trees of the Crimson Woods. Those trees did not fall easily, making the cane a priceless thing. The metal gleamed under the flame from the fireplace as he caught sight of it, winking as Hisashi moved back to him as if taunting Izuku. "I hate when you make me do this," Hisashi said. Izuku grimaced, his face hidden by his lowered head. "I know, father." In truth, he knew that the Duke could never keep a smile from his lips when he lashed his son. "How many hits do you deserve?" Izuku's stomach turned at the unexpected question. His father had always chosen the number of lashes on his own. Why would he give Izuku the choice today? "I asked you a question, son." Hisashi's tone was harsh and unforgiving. The Omega swallowed nervously. If he said a number too low, he would be chastised. If he said a number too high, Hisashi would enact it with no regret. The distress was certainly his intention. 5 should suffice. Hisashi pinched the bare skin of his back harshly. You will get 5 more for your disrespect. Call me by my title. 10 lashes, Your Grace, Izuku said tensely. The wooden floors creaked as Hisashi stepped closer. Prepare yourself, prize, he said, though he did not hesitate to land the first blow. It struck Izuku's shoulder, the skin bursting with pain. Izuku bit his lip hard at the sting. Do not forget yourself, Hisashi chided, meanly rubbing the cane over already inflamed skin. 1, Izuku whispered, flinching as another lash landed on his back. 2. He held back the urge to scream in pain at each lash, but he could not stop his tears when Hisashi focused on areas he had already struck. 5. The cane whistled as it struck again, causing Izuku to grunt. 6. Hisashi audibly panted behind him. He was excited, thrilled. Disgust boiled in Izuku's gut. 8. 9. There was a lengthy pause before the last hit. Hisashi dragged it out, letting Izuku squirm in anticipation. The red skin of his back stung, doubtlessly covered in welts already. He could feel a trickle of blood running down his flank and realized that the wood of the cane had cut him during one blow. Izuku risked a peek behind him and saw his father's back as he stood in front of the fireplace. His eyes widened in realization as he turned back, fresh tears pricking at his eyes. God's hand burns when it acts through me, Hisashi told him, returning to his place just behind Izuku's kneeling, trembling form. It is only fair that you should burn as well. The last strike was more painful than all of the prior ones combined. It landed right in the center of his back over already existing welts. The cane's blood metal was hot, the wood resisting fire as all trees in the Crimson Woods did. Izuku could not hold back his sobs. He could only hope that Yagi was standing far enough outside the door that he could not hear them. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.